Hello, traveller. Tonight, we set out on the entire story of the Bronze Age, the first great connected world, an age of god-kings and bronze swords and cities of gold that stretched from Egypt to Greece to the edge of the East, and then, in the space of a single lifetime, collapsed so completely and so mysteriously that we are still, 3,000 years later, arguing about what destroyed it. Before we begin, take a moment, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel. But only if these journeys are truly yours. And leave a word below to say where you're listening from tonight, and the hour it is where you are. There's a quiet pleasure in seeing who else has gathered here tonight, in how many countries, under how many skies. Now, let the lights go low, let the world go quiet, and let's step into the story together. There is a clay tablet, small enough to hold in one hand, that was dug out of the ruins of a burned city on the coast of what is now Syria. It is a letter, and it was never sent. The king who dictated it was writing, in the last days of his kingdom, to another king far away, begging for help that would never come. "The enemy ships are already here," the letter says. "They have set fire to my towns and done terrible things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops are away, and the land is left to itself? The 7 ships that appeared did us great harm." And then the letter stops, because there was no time to send it, because the city was burning as the words were being pressed into the wet clay, and the fire that destroyed everything else in that city did the one thing that saved the letter. It baked the soft clay hard, like a pot in a kiln, and sealed those last desperate words for 3,000 years, so that when archaeologists lifted the tablet out of the ash, they were reading, in effect, the final message of a dying world. That city was called Ugarit, and it was one of the richest and most cosmopolitan places on Earth, a great harbour where the ships and caravans of half the world met to trade. And it was not alone in its dying. All across the eastern Mediterranean, in the years around 1200 before the Common Era, the same thing was happening. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, palace after palace, going up in flames and never being rebuilt. Within about 50 years, almost every major power of the age was gone. The great empires that had ruled for centuries simply ceased to exist. The cities emptied. The kings vanished. Writing itself, in some places, was forgotten. An entire civilization. Connected, literate, wealthy, sophisticated, the most advanced the world had yet seen. Fell off the edge of history and did not come back for hundreds of years. And here is the strange part, the part that makes this one of the greatest mysteries in the whole human story. We do not know, for certain, why. We know that it happened. We can walk through the burned layers of a dozen ruined cities and touch the ash. We can read the last frightened letters. We can see, in the archaeological record, the exact moment the lights went out. But the cause, the thing that brought down an entire interconnected world in a single generation, remains genuinely, honestly unknown. There is no single villain we can point to and say, this is what did it. And that absence, that missing answer at the very center of the story, is what makes it worth sitting with tonight. So this will be, like the best of these long nights, a kind of detective story. But a detective story of an unusual kind, because the culprit may not be a culprit at all, and the crime may have no single cause. We will build, first, the world that fell, because you cannot feel the weight of a collapse until you have seen what was standing. We will walk through the golden, connected, astonishing world of the late Bronze Age at its height. Then we will watch it burn, city by city, and stand in the ash of the great catastrophe. And then, in the deepest part of the night, we will do the honest thing the mystery demands. We will weigh, one by one, all the suspects. The earthquakes, the drought, the famine, the mysterious invaders from the sea, the fatal fragility of an overconnected world. And we will find that no single one of them can be the whole answer, and that the truth is almost certainly stranger and more troubling than any single cause. That a whole world can die, not from one great blow, but from many blows at once, falling together, in a perfect storm from which there is no recovering. Let us begin where every collapse begins, not with the fall, but with the height. Before we walk into the golden world, it is worth being honest, right at the start, about how we know what we know, and about the shape of the hole at the center of this story, because the mystery is not a trick or a teaser. It is real, and it is made of the specific limits of the evidence, and understanding those limits is the first step to understanding why the smartest people who have ever studied this collapse still cannot fully agree on what caused it. We have, essentially, 4 kinds of evidence, and each one tells us something, and each one falls silent exactly where we most want it to speak. The first is the ground itself, the archaeology, the burned cities. This is the hardest, surest evidence we have. When a city burns and is buried, it leaves a layer, a horizon of ash and collapsed brick and broken pottery, and archaeologists can dig down to it and date it, and across the whole eastern Mediterranean they find the same terrible layer at roughly the same time. The destruction horizon, the black band in the earth that marks the end of the Bronze Age world. So we know, beyond any doubt, that a great wave of destruction happened. Dig down through the ruins of a Bronze Age city, and you read its history in layers, like pages. Here, the prosperous town of the golden years, its houses and streets and pottery. And then, sharply, a layer of burning. Ash, charcoal, collapsed and fire-reddened brick, sometimes the very bodies of the people caught in the fall, crushed or burned where they lay. And then, above that black horizon, either nothing at all, or a thinner, poorer, cruder settlement built later by humbler hands that never approached the wealth of what lay beneath. That black band of destruction appears in city after city across the whole eastern Mediterranean, dated again and again to the same fatal span of decades. It is the single most solid fact we possess about the collapse. It happened, it was violent, it was vast, and it was very nearly everywhere at once. But the ash tells us that a city burned. It does not tell us who burned it, or why, or whether the fire came from an invading army, an earthquake, a civil war, or a family knocking over a lamp during a panic. The ground gives us the fact of the catastrophe and withholds its cause. The second kind of evidence is the most poignant, the last letters. These great kingdoms were literate. They kept archives. They wrote to one another constantly, and in a handful of cases. Ugarit above all. The final correspondence survived, baked hard by the very fires that ended the kingdoms. These letters are extraordinary. They are voices speaking to us from the last days, full of fear and confusion, begging for grain, reporting enemy ships, calling up troops. But they are fragments, and they are the view from inside the burning building. The people writing them did not know what was happening to them any better than a person inside a collapsing house knows the engineering of the collapse. They knew ships had come, or the harvest had failed, or the enemy was at the gate. They did not know they were living through the end of an age, and they could not step back to see the whole pattern. Their letters are precious, and they are blind. The third kind of evidence is the silence that follows. And silence, it turns out, is evidence too. After the destruction, in many places, the writing simply stops. The Greek script we call Linear B, used to keep the palace accounts of the Mycenaean world, vanishes utterly, and Greece will not write again for something like 400 years. The great diplomatic archives go dead. The trade goods stop moving. And this long silence, this dark age, tells us how total the collapse was. Not a bad decade, not a hard war, but the wholesale unmaking of a civilization so complete that the very skill of writing was lost. But silence, by its nature, cannot explain itself. It marks the depth of the wound without naming the weapon. And the fourth kind of evidence is the strangest, the theories themselves and the way they fail. For a century and more, brilliant people have studied this collapse, and each has proposed a cause. Invaders, earthquakes, drought, disease, systems failure. And here is the revealing thing. Each theory explains part of the evidence beautifully, and none of them explains all of it. The invaders explain the burned cities, but not the drought written in the ancient pollen. The drought explains the famine, but not why fortified palaces fell so fast. The earthquakes explain some ruins, but not the ones with weapons in the ash. Every single cause theory, held up to the full body of evidence, springs a leak. And that pattern, that no one suspect fits all the facts, is itself the most important clue we have. It is the thing that points, in the end, away from any single villain and towards something harder to grasp, a collapse with many causes at once. So we will hold that clue in our hands through the whole night, and we will not force an answer the evidence refuses to give. First, though, the world. Let us see what was lost. To understand why this world was so brilliant and why it was so fragile, you have to understand the one substance it was named for, the metal that gave the age its character and, in the end, may have helped to kill it: bronze. Bronze is not a natural metal. You cannot dig it out of the ground. It is a made thing, an alloy, a marriage of two separate metals: copper, which is fairly common, and tin, which is extraordinarily rare. Melt them together in the right proportion, roughly 9 parts copper to 1 part tin, and you get something far better than either alone. A metal hard enough to hold a fine edge, tough enough to survive a battle, and beautiful enough to shine like gold when it is polished. Bronze made the swords and the spearheads and the arrow points. It made the armor and the great two-wheeled war chariots' fittings. It made the tools that built the palaces and the fine vessels that graced the tables of kings. An army was only as strong as its bronze. A kingdom that could not arm its soldiers with bronze could not survive. Bronze was, quite simply, the strategic material of the age, the thing on which power itself depended. The way steel would matter later, or oil, or the microchip. And here is the crucial thing, the thing that made this whole world both possible and precarious. The two metals that make bronze do not come from the same place. Copper was mined in many locations. The great mines of Cyprus supplied much of the Mediterranean. But tin, the rare and essential 10th part, came from almost nowhere near the centers of civilization. The nearest large sources were far away, in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, thousands of miles to the east, and perhaps in a few other distant and hard-to-reach places. Think about what that means. To make the bronze that armed his soldiers and equipped his kingdom, an Egyptian pharaoh or a Hittite king or a Mycenaean lord needed tin that had to travel, hand to hand, caravan to ship to caravan, across thousands of miles of desert and sea and mountain, through the territory of a dozen other peoples, every step of the way. The tin had to be dug from the ground in the mountains of the distant east, then carried by pack animal across deserts and over passes, sold and resold at each stage, handed from one people to the next, loaded onto ships, sailed across seas, unloaded, carried again, until at last, after a journey of thousands of miles and many months and many middlemen, it reached the workshop of a smith in Egypt or Greece, who melted it with his copper and poured out a sword. No single kingdom controlled the whole supply. The bronze that held the whole world together could only exist if the whole world stayed connected. If the trade routes stayed open, if the ships kept sailing, if the caravans kept crossing, if kings kept the peace that let the metal move. It is worth pausing on how astonishing this was. A bronze sword in the hand of a Mycenaean warrior was, in a sense, a physical knot tying together half the world. The copper perhaps from Cyprus, the tin from a mine so distant that the Greeks who wielded the finished blade had almost certainly never heard of the mountains it came from and could not have found them on any map they possessed. The whole system worked without any single mind overseeing it, without maps, without any of the tools we would think necessary to run a trade network spanning a continent. Worked purely through the linked self-interest of 1,000 merchants and middlemen, each handing the precious metal along to the next, across deserts and seas and mountains and the borders of hostile kingdoms, for month after month, year after year, generation after generation. It was, for its time, a kind of miracle of coordination, and like all such delicate miracles, it held only as long as the conditions that allowed it held. Break enough of the links, and the whole chain fails, and the tin stops, and the bronze stops, and the swords, and the tools, and the armor stop with them. This is the first and deepest truth about the late Bronze Age. It was the first age of globalization. It was a single, vast, interconnected system in which distant kingdoms depended on one another for the most essential materials of survival. The tin from the eastern mountains, the copper from Cyprus, the gold from Egypt and Nubia, the timber from Lebanon, the fine oils and wines and textiles, the lapis lazuli and the ivory and the exotic goods of a dozen lands. All of it moved along a web of routes that bound Egypt to Greece, to Anatolia, to Mesopotamia, to the islands of the sea, so that a king in one land ate from bowls made in another, and armed his soldiers with metal mined at the far edge of the known world. It was an achievement of astonishing sophistication, and it carried within it, from the very beginning, a hidden fragility. Because a system where everyone depends on everyone, where the essential materials must travel across the whole world to reach anyone, is a system that works beautifully as long as it works at all, and that can come apart with terrifying speed if enough of the connections break at once. We will come back to that fragility at the end of the night, when we weigh the suspects. For now, hold on to the image. A whole shining world, held together by threads of trade stretched across thousands of miles, every kingdom bound to every other by the need for the metal that made them all. The men who ruled this connected world knew that they ruled it together, and they had a remarkable way of describing their relationship. They called one another brother, the great kings of the age. The Pharaoh of Egypt, the king of the Hittites, the king of Babylon, the king of Assyria, the king of a land called Mitanni, formed a kind of club, an exclusive brotherhood of great powers, and they wrote to one another as equals and family, in letters of a formality and warmth that can still, across 3,000 years, make you smile. We know this because of one of the most wonderful archaeological discoveries ever made, a cache of clay tablets found at a site in Egypt called Amarna, the diplomatic archive of the pharaohs, hundreds of letters exchanged between the Egyptian court and the other powers of the age. And reading them is like eavesdropping on the group correspondence of the most powerful people in the world. To the king of Egypt, my brother, a Babylonian king writes, and then proceeds, brother, to complain that the gold the pharaoh sent him was of poor quality. The gold you sent, I put it in the kiln, and not even a fraction of it came out pure. Kings send one another gifts and expect gifts in return, and they keep careful count. One king writes, wounded, that his brother king has not sent word in a long time, and that his messenger was kept waiting far too long at the foreign court, and that this is no way to treat a brother. The letters are astonishingly human beneath their royal formality. A king pleads for a particular Egyptian physician to be sent to him, or for skilled craftsmen, or for more gold. Always more gold. For in my brother's land, gold is as plentiful as dust. A father-in-law frets over a daughter married off to the pharaoh and asks, with real feeling, whether she is well and whether she is loved. When the Egyptian king sends a wooden statue instead of the solid gold one that had been promised for a bride's dowry, the wronged king's outrage leaps off the tablet across 3,000 years. And running under all of it is anxiety about the messengers themselves. Men who spent months, sometimes years, on the road between courts, carrying these very tablets, and whose detention or mistreatment was a diplomatic insult of the first order, because they were the living threads that held the whole brotherhood together. A single royal letter might take months to travel from one court to another, carried by a messenger who crossed deserts and mountains and hostile borders, lodged and fed at each court along the way, sometimes held for years before he was allowed to return. And the whole delicate system of alliance and trade and marriage depended on these slow human threads holding, letter after letter, gift after gift, across the decades. It was a remarkably personal way to run a world, not through institutions or treaties enforced by courts, but through the maintained goodwill of a handful of god-kings who chose, most of the time, to treat one another as family, and to keep the messengers moving, and to let the metal and the grain and the daughters flow. When that goodwill held, the world prospered. When it failed, when the messengers stopped coming, when the letters went unanswered, when the brotherhood frayed, there was nothing underneath to catch the fall. Another haggles over the bride price for a princess, or complains that the promised gold has not arrived, or that what did arrive was less than agreed. They arrange marriages, sending their daughters across the world to seal alliances. They ask after one another's health and the health of one another's wives and horses and countries. They lend one another physicians and craftsmen, and when one of them is snubbed, when a gift is too small, or a messenger is kept waiting too long, or a brother king fails to write for too long, they complain with all the wounded feeling of family. Beneath the courtesy, of course, was hard power and harder calculation. These kings were rivals as much as brothers. They fought wars, they schemed, they backed one another's enemies when it suited them. But the remarkable thing, the thing that defined the age, is that they had built a system of managing their rivalry, a whole apparatus of diplomacy, of messengers and treaties and royal marriages and gift exchange that let them compete without constantly destroying one another, and that kept the trade routes open and the bronze flowing. It was, in its way, an international order, the first the world had known. A small number of great powers, bound by trade and diplomacy and intermarriage, managing their differences well enough to keep the whole prosperous system running. For generations it worked. The letters flowed, the gifts crossed the sea, the daughters married into distant courts, and the great kings called one another brother, and the world they ruled together was as rich and stable and connected as anything the human race had yet built. And every one of them, every single kingdom in that brotherhood, would be gone or broken beyond recognition within a few decades of the collapse. But we are still in the golden years. Let us meet them one by one, these brother kingdoms, beginning with the greatest and most familiar of them all. Begin with Egypt, because Egypt is the one everyone knows, and because in the late Bronze Age it stood at the very height of its long, astonishing life. This was the age of the new kingdom, the golden age of the pharaohs, the Egypt of the great names, of Hatshepsut and Thutmose, of Akhenaten and his strange revolution, of the boy king whose intact tomb would dazzle the world 3,000 years later, and of Ramesses the Great, who ruled for 67 years and covered the land in colossal monuments to himself. This was Egypt at its richest, its most powerful, its most confident, an empire that reached south deep into Nubia and its gold mines, and north across Sinai into the lands of the Near East, where it collided with the other great powers of the age. To the other kingdoms of the Brotherhood, Egypt was the great treasure house, the land of gold. In my brother's country, the other kings wrote enviously to the pharaoh, "Gold is as common as dust." And it was very nearly true. The gold of Nubia flowed into Egypt in quantities that made the pharaoh the richest man in the world, and the other kings were forever writing to ask for some of it, to gild a temple, to fill a treasury, to seal a marriage. Egypt sat at the wealthy southwestern corner of the connected world, slightly apart from the others, protected by its deserts and its sea, fed reliably every year by the flooding of the Nile, which did not depend on the fickle rains that watered the other kingdoms. That reliability, that self-sufficiency, would matter enormously when the collapse came. For of all the great powers, Egypt alone would survive it, battered and diminished but not destroyed. The Nile did not depend on the local Mediterranean rains at all. It was fed by the great monsoon far to the south, in the highlands of Africa, and so year after year, whatever the weather did around the rest of the collapsing world, the flood came down to Egypt and spread its dark, rich silt across the fields, and the grain grew, and Egypt ate. The one great kingdom whose food supply was, by pure geographic luck, largely beyond the reach of the drought that would strangle everyone else. But in the golden years, Egypt was simply the grandest member of the club, the oldest civilization, the richest, the one whose monuments were already ancient when the other kingdoms were young. Its pharaoh was not merely a king, but a living god, the son of the sun, whose word was the order of the cosmos. Egypt in these years was covered in building on a scale the world had never seen. Ramesses raised the vast columned hall at Karnak, whose stone pillars stand like a petrified forest so huge that later travelers could scarcely believe human hands had made it. He carved his own colossal image, 4 times over and each figure taller than a house, into the cliff at Abu Simbel, positioned so that twice a year the rising sun would strike through the temple and light the gods in the sanctuary deep within the rock. The wealth that made this possible flowed from the Nubian gold mines in the south and the tribute of a Near Eastern empire in the north, and it was administered by a vast bureaucracy of scribes and priests and officials, the most elaborate machinery of government anywhere on earth. To stand in Egypt in the reign of Ramesses was to stand at the summit of the human world. Its temples were the largest buildings on earth. Its art, its writing, its religion had endured already for well over 1,000 years, and would have seemed to any Egyptian to be simply eternal, as fixed and permanent as the Nile itself. No Egyptian standing in the shadow of those temples in the reign of Ramesses could have imagined that the whole wide world Egypt traded with and fought with and married into was about to come crashing down, or that Egypt itself would come within a hair's breadth of going down with it. But that is the end of the story. In the golden years, Egypt was eternal and golden and sure. Yet Egypt was only the grandest corner of a much wider world, and to understand what fell, we must meet the rest of the Brotherhood. Beginning in the east, in the oldest land of cities, where civilization itself had been born 2,000 years before. Before we cross the sea to meet the other great powers, we must go east, into the oldest heartland of civilization itself, to the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, where cities had already been rising and falling for 2,000 years before the Bronze Age reached its height. This was Mesopotamia, the land that had invented the city, the written word, the law code, the wheel, the very idea of an empire. And in the Golden Age, two of its great powers sat at the table of the Brotherhood of Kings. Babylon in the south, and, rising fast in the north, the fierce kingdom of Assyria. Between them, for a time, had stood a third, the kingdom of Mitanni, a power of chariot lords that once rivaled the greatest of them, before it was ground to pieces between its neighbours and vanished a little ahead of the general fall. Babylon in these years was ruled by a line of foreign kings, the Kassites, who had taken the ancient city centuries before and then, in the way of conquerors who fall in love with what they conquer, become more Babylonian than the Babylonians, restoring the old temples, honouring the old gods, keeping the old learning alive. Under them, Babylon was not the military terror it had been under Hammurabi long before, nor the terror it would become under Nebuchadnezzar long after. It was something gentler and grander, a city of ancient prestige, the cultural and religious heart of Mesopotamia, where the scribes copied and recopied the great works of literature that the region had produced across its long history. It was in this world, and in these centuries, that the Epic of Gilgamesh took something like its lasting shape. The oldest great story in the world, the tale of a king who built mighty walls and lost his dearest friend and went searching, in grief, for the secret of eternal life, only to learn that death is the lot of all people and that the walls he built were the nearest thing to immortality a man could have. That story, already ancient in the Bronze Age, was being lovingly preserved on clay tablets in the libraries of Babylon even as the Golden World moved toward its end. Assyria was a harder thing. In the north, along the upper Tigris, the Assyrians were building the foundations of what would one day become the most feared military empire the ancient Near East had ever seen. In the Golden Age, they were still only one power among several, but a rising one. Disciplined, aggressive, expanding at the expense of their neighbours, and it was Assyria, more than anyone, that finished off the wounded kingdom of Mitanni and swallowed its lands. The Assyrian kings, too, wrote to the pharaoh as brothers and demanded their share of the Egyptian gold, and the older powers eyed their rise with unease, as established powers always eye a hungry newcomer. And here is a detail that matters for the story of the collapse. Mesopotamia, further inland and east, was somewhat insulated from the very worst of what was coming. When the great catastrophe fell on the Mediterranean world, when the palaces of Greece burned and the Hittite Empire vanished and Ugarit died, the cities of the rivers were battered but not destroyed. Babylon endured. Assyria, remarkably, would emerge from the dark centuries that followed not weaker but stronger to build the terrifying empire of its later fame. Like Egypt, though for different reasons of geography and distance, the Mesopotamian heartland was far enough from the epicenter to survive the shattering of the connected world. But it, too, was diminished by the fall, cut off from the trade, the diplomacy, the shared brilliance of the Golden Age. And it, too, entered a poorer, darker, more isolated time. The whole eastern half of the Brotherhood, the ancient river cities that had taught the world to be civilized, felt the cold when the Golden World went out. But the rivers are the deep past. The great rival that could face Egypt as an equal lay to the north and west, across the mountains, in the land we now call Turkey. Cross to it now. There is a strange test you can run on the late Bronze Age. Name its great powers to almost anyone, and they will know Egypt, and perhaps Babylon, and perhaps Mycenaean Greece. But there was another empire, fully the equal of Egypt, that dominated the whole of what is now Turkey and much of the Near East for centuries. An empire with a great capital, a mighty army, a written language, and a king who called the pharaoh his brother and met him on the battlefield as an equal. And almost no one today has heard of it. This was the empire of the Hittites, and its near-total disappearance from human memory is itself a small foretaste of the great forgetting the collapse would bring. The Hittites ruled from a formidable capital called Hattusa, high on the windswept Anatolian plateau, a city of massive stone walls and gates carved with lions and warrior gods, its temples and archives spread across the rock. From this mountain stronghold, the Hittite kings built an empire that stretched across Anatolia and down into Syria, where it pressed against the northern edge of Egypt's sphere, and the two great powers ground against each other for generations. That collision produced one of the most famous battles of the ancient world, fought at a place called Kadesh in Syria, where the young Ramesses the Great and the Hittite king led enormous armies of chariots against each other in a clash so huge and so evenly matched that both sides claimed victory and neither could truly win. Ramesses covered the walls of his temples back in Egypt with heroic reliefs of his triumph at Kadesh. The Hittite records tell a rather different story. And in the end, exhausted, the two superpowers did the sensible thing. They made peace. The treaty they signed, between Ramesses and the Hittite king, survives in both the Egyptian and the Hittite versions, and it is the oldest surviving peace treaty in human history, a genuine diplomatic document between two great powers agreeing to stop fighting, to respect each other's borders, and to come to each other's aid against common enemies. A copy of it hangs, fittingly, at the headquarters of the United Nations. Think of what that means. The oldest surviving diplomatic treaty in the world, struck between two Bronze Age god kings more than 3,000 years ago, is considered so fine an example of peacemaking that the modern community of nations chose to display it on its own wall. The kings who made it could not have imagined the United Nations, but they understood, perfectly, the thing it exists to do. The management of rivalry between great powers so that it need not always end in slaughter. And having fought each other to a bloody standstill, they did exactly that. They wrote down their borders, swore by their gods, exchanged a royal daughter in marriage to seal the bond, and kept a peace that held for the rest of their kingdom's lives. The battle it ended had been a near catastrophe for Egypt. Ramesses, young and eager for glory, had marched north with his army divided into 4 divisions, and the Hittite king, hiding his forces behind the city of Kadesh, had lured the pharaoh forward and then struck his strung-out columns with a massive chariot charge, very nearly destroying the Egyptian army before it could form up. By Ramesses' own dramatic telling, the pharaoh found himself almost alone, cut off, surrounded by enemy chariots, and fought his way out by sheer heroism and the favor of the gods until reinforcements arrived and the day was saved. The reality was probably less heroic and more of a bloody draw, but the scale of it. Thousands of chariots, tens of thousands of men, the two greatest powers of the age locked in combat, tells you what kind of world this was, one in which superpowers with vast professional armies contended for dominance across the Near East, exactly as great powers would in every later age. So the Hittites were no minor people. They were one of the twin superpowers of the age, masters of the war chariot, early workers of iron, rulers of a vast and sophisticated empire with a complex law code and a rich literature preserved on thousands of clay tablets in their mountain archives. And they were, as we will see, uniquely vulnerable when the bad years came, because their heartland on the high Anatolian plateau depended on the rains and grew little surplus and had to import grain to feed itself in hard times. When the collapse came, the Hittite Empire did not slowly decline. It vanished. Hattusa, the great capital, was abandoned and burned, its people simply gone, its very location forgotten so completely that for 3,000 years no one knew where the empire of the Hittites had even been. When the first modern excavators came upon the ruins high on the Anatolian plateau and began to dig, they found the enormous circuit of walls, the great gates flanked by carved lions and sphinxes, the foundations of vast temples, and, most precious of all, the royal archives, room after room of clay tablets, tens of thousands of them, the diplomatic and administrative and religious records of the empire, written in a language no one could yet read. The slow decipherment of that language and the reading of those tablets resurrected an entire lost superpower from total oblivion until archaeologists in the modern age dug into a Turkish hillside and found the lion gates and the archives of a lost superpower. Remember, Hattusa, we will return to its silent, burned ruins when the world falls. But before leaving the Hittites, there is one more thing to understand about them and about every great power of their age. The terrifying and expensive machine on which all their power rested, and which would, when the world fell, prove to have been far more fragile than anyone guessed. The defining weapon of the late Bronze Age was not the sword or the spear. It was the chariot, a light, 2-wheeled, horse-drawn platform carrying a driver and an archer, and it dominated the battlefields of the age so completely that the great powers measured their strength in chariots the way later empires would measure it in warships. At Kadesh, where the Hittites and the Egyptians met, the two armies between them fielded something like 5,000 of them, a thundering mass of horses and wheels and bowmen, and the sight of it must have been one of the most extraordinary things any human being of that century ever saw. To understand what a chariot was, it helps to understand what it cost. Every part of it sat at the far end of a long chain of specialist skill and long-distance trade. The wheels were bentwood, steamed and shaped by craftsmen who had spent their lives learning it, with spokes cut so fine that the whole vehicle weighed almost nothing and could turn at speed without shattering. The fittings were bronze, which meant copper from Cyprus, and tin from the Far East, which meant the trade network. The archer carried a composite bow, built up from wood and horn and sinew glued in layers, a weapon that took a craftsman more than a year to make and could drive an arrow through armor at a distance no simple bow could match. The horses were the most expensive part of all. Not the small draft animals of the farm, but trained chariot teams, bred and conditioned over years. There survives, from the Hittite archives, an astonishing document. A horse training manual written by a Mitanni expert named Kikuli, laying out a training regime of many months in careful detail, the exercises, the feeding, the intervals of rest and work, the conditioning of the animals for the endurance the battlefield demanded. It is one of the oldest technical manuals in the world, and its existence tells you exactly how seriously these kingdoms took the machine at the heart of their power. And because chariots were so expensive, they created a particular kind of society. Only the wealthy could own one, only the state could field them in numbers, and the men who fought from them formed a distinct aristocracy of warriors, maintained by the palace, granted land and privileges, occupying a place at the top of the social order that was theirs by virtue of the machine they rode. Across the whole connected world, from Greece to Egypt to Anatolia to Mesopotamia, the same pattern repeated: a chariot elite, small in number, enormously powerful, bound to the palace that equipped it, standing above a mass of ordinary people who farmed and built and rode. The palace paid for the chariots defended the palace, and the whole arrangement rested, in the end, on the same fragile web of long-distance trade that everything else in the golden world rested on. Cut the tin, and you cannot make the bronze fittings. Break the trade, and the horses and the craftsmen and the bowyers grow scarce. The most fearsome military system in the world was, underneath, just one more thing that depended on the ships continuing to sail. There is a further point, and it will matter greatly when the story turns to the collapse, because one of the more striking theories about the fall concerns exactly this. Chariot armies had a weakness. They were devastating against other chariot armies and against troops who fought in the old way. But they were vulnerable to something new that appeared in the late Bronze Age. Masses of foot soldiers, lightly armoured and highly mobile, carrying javelins and a new kind of long, slashing sword, who could swarm a chariot from angles it could not answer, kill the horses, and bring the whole expensive machine down. Some scholars have argued that the collapse was, in significant part, a military revolution. That the great palace states fell because the basis of their military supremacy was suddenly obsolete, because bands of infantry, who owned nothing, could now defeat the chariot aristocracies that had ruled for centuries. It is a contested theory, and like every theory in this story, it explains some things and not others, and it will come back for its hearing later. But hold the image, because it is a haunting one. The glittering chariot elite of the golden world, the most privileged warriors on earth, suddenly finding themselves surrounded on foot by hungry men with javelins, and discovering that everything their power rested on had quietly ceased to be true. Now cross the sea westward to meet the warlords of a rugged land of stone citadels, the Greeks who lived long before Greece, long before the Greece of philosophers and marble temples and democracy. A full 7 or 8 centuries before all of that. There was another Greece, a Greece of the Bronze Age, and it was a harder, darker, more warlike place. We call it Mycenaean, after its greatest citadel, Mycenae, and it is the world that the poet Homer, writing centuries later in the age that followed the collapse, half remembered and half invented in his great poems of the Trojan War, the heroes of the Iliad, Agamemnon, Achilles, the war against Troy. are echoes distorted by centuries of retelling of this vanished Bronze Age Greek world. The Mycenaean Greeks were not a united nation, but a collection of small, fierce kingdoms, each centered on a mighty citadel. Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, built of stones so huge that later Greeks, unable to believe mere humans had moved them, credited the work to giants. Behind their cyclopean walls, the Mycenaean warlords lived a life of war and wealth and display. They were buried with golden death masks and bronze weapons and hoards of treasure. They rode to war in chariots and buried their dead lords with bronze swords and daggers inlaid with gold, and set over the faces of their kings masks beaten from sheet gold, so that even in the grave the warlord wore the sun. Their citadels were built for war, approached by narrow ramps that exposed an attacker's unshielded side, guarded by massive gates and secret protected stairways down to hidden springs, so that a besieged garrison would never run out of water. Everything about them speaks of a hard, proud, martial people, wealthy from trade and raid, ruling from their stone strongholds over the farmers and craftsmen of the surrounding land. They kept meticulous palace accounts on clay tablets, in that early Greek script called Linear B, accounts of grain and oil and livestock and weapons and workers, the careful bookkeeping of a palace economy that gathered in the produce of the land and redistributed it. And they were sailors and traders and raiders, ranging across the sea, planting their goods and their presence in ports all around the eastern Mediterranean, plugged fully into the great connected world. But the Mycenaean world was, in a way, the most fragile of all the great powers, because it was the most tightly wound. Everything ran through the palace. The palace controlled the economy, gathered the surplus, organized the labor, stored the grain, redistributed the goods, kept the records. It was a system of exquisite centralization, and that meant that if the palace fell, everything fell, because there was nothing underneath it, no independent structure that could survive without the central authority. Destroy the palace, and you did not merely change the government, you erased the entire system of life, the economy, the record-keeping, the redistribution, all at once. And that is very nearly what happened. The glory of Mycenae passed into myth, into Homer's half-remembered songs of gods and heroes, and the real Bronze Age Greece slept under the earth until the archaeologists came. But that is the fall. In the golden years, the citadels stood proud on their hills, the warlords feasted in their painted halls, and the ships of Mycenae crossed a sea that still, for a little while longer, held together. And no ship tells the story of that connected sea better than one that never reached its harbour at all. Return now to the city where we began, to Ugarit, on the coast of Syria, the city of the last unsent letter. Because in the golden years, before the fire, Ugarit was one of the most remarkable places in the whole connected world, and it shows us a side of the age that the great warrior kingdoms do not, the world of trade, of the merchant, of the crossroads where everything and everyone met. Ugarit was not a great military power. It was something more interesting, a great commercial one. It sat at a perfect crossroads, where the trade routes coming down from Anatolia and across from Mesopotamia met the sea lanes of the Mediterranean, and it grew fabulously rich as the middleman, the meeting place, the port where the goods of the whole world changed hands. Through Ugarit's harbour passed the copper of Cyprus and the tin from the east, the gold of Egypt, the timber of Lebanon, the wine and oil of the Mediterranean, the fine textiles and worked metal and luxury goods of a dozen lands. Its merchants grew wealthy, its warehouses bulged, its harbour was thick with the ships of many nations. The city itself was a marvel of the age. A royal palace of many rooms, with its own archives and a great courtyard, houses of stone rising along paved streets, temples on the Acropolis to the storm god and the other deities of the Canaanite world, workshops of bronze smiths and potters and dyers, and everywhere the traffic of trade. Goods coming in from the sea and the caravan roads, being weighed and reckoned and stored and sold and shipped on. Rich private houses had their own family tombs beneath the floors and their own small libraries of clay tablets. It was a city that lived by the pen and the scale and the ship, a place where a dozen peoples and languages met and did business, one of the true crossroads of the Bronze Age world. And because it was a place where so many peoples met, it was a place of many languages and many scripts, a genuinely cosmopolitan city. And it made, or adopted, a marvelous invention that points toward the future. A simple alphabet, cuneiform in form but alphabetic in principle, one of the early steps on the road to the alphabet that almost all of us, in one form or another, still use today. The archives of Ugarit, again baked hard and preserved by the fire that destroyed the city, give us an extraordinarily intimate picture of this merchant world. We have the business records, the contracts, the letters between trading partners, the accounts of cargoes and debts and shipments. We have the diplomatic correspondence, Ugarit's letters to and from the great powers, especially its overlords, the Hittites, to whom it owed tribute and military service. We can see the whole rich texture of a great trading city going about its prosperous business. Buying, selling, shipping, lending, the endless profitable churn of a crossroads of the world. And it is precisely this intimacy, this wealth of detail about ordinary prosperous life that makes Ugarit's end so haunting. Because we can watch, in those same archives, the prosperity curdle into fear. We can read the letters grow anxious, reports of enemy ships, requests for grain, orders to send troops away to defend the overlord, warnings of danger on the sea. And then, at the very end, that last unsent letter, the enemy ships already in the harbour, the towns already burning. Ugarit shows us the connected world at its most vivid and most human, the merchant sea at its busiest and richest. And then shows us, in its own archived words, exactly what it felt like when that world began to die. But to feel the full, astonishing reach of that connected sea, there is one more thing to see. A single ship that sank in the golden years with its cargo intact and lay on the seafloor for 3,000 years, waiting to tell us just how wide the Bronze Age world really was. Off the southern coast of Turkey, at a rocky point called Uluburun, a ship went down in the late Bronze Age, sometime around 1300 before the Common Era, at the height of the Golden World, and sank in deep water and settled on the seafloor and stayed there, undisturbed, for more than 3,000 years, until sponge divers found it in the 1980s and archaeologists began, painstakingly, to bring it up. And the cargo of that one ship is perhaps the single most eloquent piece of evidence we have for just how vast and connected the Bronze Age world truly was. It is a museum of an entire civilization sealed in the sea. Consider what was on board. There were 10 tons of copper, cast into ingots shaped like ox hides for easy carrying. The copper of Cyprus, enough to arm a small army. There was a ton of tin. The rare, precious tin from the distant east, the essential 10th part, and the two metals travelling together in exactly the proportion needed to make bronze, as if the ship were carrying the raw material of power itself. There were dozens of ingots of raw glass, deep blue, coloured to imitate precious stone. There were huge storage jars, and inside one of them, nested for shipping, a full set of fine pottery. There were logs of ebony from Africa. There was ivory, both elephant and hippopotamus. There were ostrich eggshells. There was Baltic amber, which had travelled overland all the way from the shores of northern Europe. There were tools and weapons and jewellery. There was a scarab of gold bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. There were the personal possessions of the crew and the merchants from at least 2 different cultures, suggesting the ship itself was a joint venture of many peoples. There were weights for weighing goods in trade, in several different standards, so that a merchant could reckon a fair exchange whether he was dealing with an Egyptian, a Levantine, or a Greek. There were tools, a carpenter's kit, fishing gear, oil lamps. There were beads of amber and faience and glass, and pieces of jewellery, and cylinder seals of the kind used across the Near East to mark ownership and seal documents. There was even, among the cargo, a folding wooden writing board, a kind of ancient notebook whose wax surface could be written on and smoothed and written on again. The very tool of the literate, connected, record-keeping world, riding in the hold of a merchant ship between one great kingdom and the next. And there were humbler, more human things aboard too, the kind that turn an archaeological site into a story. Fishing weights and hooks, showing the crew fed themselves from the sea as they sailed, oil lamps to light the ship at night, pan-balance weights worn smooth from use, a few pieces of personal jewellery, even, among the cargo, tortoise shells that may have been meant to become the sounding boxes of lyres. One imagines the men aboard on their last evening, reckoning the day's run, mending a net, trimming a lamp, with no notion that their ship would go down off that rocky point and lie in the dark water for 3,000 years, until it became the single most complete window we possess onto the reach and richness of the Bronze Age world. And what that window shows, above all, is how wrong the old picture of the ancient world was. The picture of isolated kingdoms, each in its own valley, dimly aware of anything beyond the next range of hills. The Uluburun ship was a floating argument against that picture. Its cargo had been gathered from 3 continents. Its crew, judging by the personal possessions aboard, may well have come from more than one nation. Its route touched Egypt, Cyprus, the Levantine coast, the Aegean. It was, in every sense, an international vessel in an international age. And it went down, with all of it, on an ordinary voyage that no one recorded, in a world so accustomed to such voyages that the loss of one ship was not worth writing about. Stop and think about what a single such ship means. It means that in the golden years, one merchant vessel might carry, in a single voyage, copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, glass from the Near East, ebony and ivory from Africa, amber from the Baltic, gold from Egypt, and pottery and goods from Greece and beyond. The products of a web of trade that stretched literally from the Baltic Sea to Africa to Central Asia, all meeting on the deck of one ship crossing the eastern Mediterranean. This was not a world of isolated kingdoms occasionally sending an embassy. This was a dense, working, everyday global economy in which materials and goods flowed constantly across thousands of miles, binding the whole known world into a single interdependent system. The Uluburun ship is the golden world made solid. Its reach, its wealth, its astonishing interconnection, all preserved by the accident of a sinking. And it is also, if you know what is coming, unbearably poignant. Because that whole magnificent web of connection, that entire system that put Baltic amber and Egyptian gold on the same deck, was the very thing that could not survive what was about to happen. The connection that made the world rich was the connection that would let the collapse spread from end to end. But that is still to come. First, let the story rest at the harbour in the golden evening before the fire. The story has climbed a long way already tonight, up through the golden world. Through the making of bronze and the brotherhood of kings, through Egypt's gold and the lost empire of the Hittites, through the citadels of Mycenae and the merchant wealth of Ugarit and the astonishing sunken cargo of the Uluburun ship. And before it turns, as it must, toward the fire, it pauses here at the height of the golden years, in a great harbour in the evening, and lets the quiet come. Picture a harbour of the late Bronze Age at the close of a summer day. Ugarit, perhaps, or any of the great ports of that connected sea. The day's work is ending. The ships lie at anchor or drawn up on the shore, their sails furled, their cargoes unloaded, the ox-hide ingots of copper stacked on the quay, the great storage jars, the bales and bundles of a dozen lands. The last porters are carrying the day's goods into the warehouses. The merchants are closing their accounts, pressing the day's final figures into clay by lamplight. And out beyond the breakwater, the sea goes gold, then rose, then the deep wine dark of the Mediterranean evening, and the first stars come out over water that has carried the wealth of the whole world safely into this harbour, as it has every evening for as long as anyone can remember. The air smells of salt and cedar and smoke, and the days catch. Somewhere a sailor is singing, in a language that will be dead within a century and forgotten within 4. The great connected world is doing what it has always done, quietly, at the end of a day, resting, counting its gains, making ready to do it all again tomorrow. And there is no shadow on it yet. That is the thing to hold, in this rest, before the story turns dark. That the people in that golden harbour had no idea. They were not living in the last days of a doomed age. They were living in an ordinary, prosperous evening of a world that had stood for centuries and had every reason to believe it would stand for centuries more. The ships would sail tomorrow. The tin would come from the east as it always had. The kings would write their letters and exchange their gifts and marry their daughters across the sea. The harbour would fill and empty and fill again. Everything they could see told them the world was solid and permanent and safe. It is one of the quiet mercies of not knowing the future, that the people of the golden world got to enjoy it as an ordinary thing, unhaunted, right up until the end. So let the harbour lie there in the last gold light, the ships at rest, the warehouses full, the stars coming out over the wine-dark sea, the whole connected world breathing easy in the warm evening, sure of itself, sure of tomorrow, one of the last untroubled evenings of the Bronze Age. And let it be peaceful, because it was, and because the people who lived it deserved that peace, and did not know, and were, for this one evening, and for a little while longer, safe. When the story rises again, the first tremors will already be running through the golden world. But not yet. For now there is only the harbour, and the gold light going to rose on the water, and the ships at rest, and the first stars, and the deep, warm, untroubled quiet of a world that does not yet know. The end did not come all at once, like a thunderclap out of a clear sky. Looking back, from our vantage 3,000 years later, we can see that the golden world had been growing quietly anxious for some time before the fire. That there were tremors running through it, small signs of strain, warnings that something was wrong in the decades before the great collapse. The people living through them did not know what they were reading, of course. They were the ordinary troubles of any age, a bad harvest here, a raid there, a nervous letter, and no one could see the pattern forming. But we can see it now, and the pattern is unmistakable. The golden world, in its last decades, was a world under mounting stress. The letters are the first place you can feel it. In the diplomatic correspondence of the last years, a new note creeps in. A note of anxiety, of shortage, of fear. Kings write to one another not about gifts and marriages now, but about grain. "There is no grain in my land," one writes. "Send grain, send it urgently. It is a matter of life and death." In one remarkable exchange, arrangements are made for great quantities of grain to be shipped by sea to the hungry Hittite lands, and the matter is spoken of as urgent, a question of survival, with the king stressing that his people will die without it. This from the ruling power of a mighty empire, reduced, at the end, to begging its neighbours and vassals for bread and organising emergency convoys of grain across the sea to keep its people alive. The Hittite king, whose mountain empire could not feed itself in hard times, writes with growing desperation about the need for grain shipments and orders that ships be sent, and frets about famine. This is new. In the confident golden years, the great powers wrote about luxuries and honour and dynastic marriages. Now, at the end, they are writing about hunger, about the basic problem of feeding their people, and the urgency in the letters is real and rising. Something was going wrong with the food, and the trouble was not only hunger. In the same last decades, the correspondence and the archaeology together hint at a fraying of the whole confident order, complaints of merchants robbed and messengers no longer safe on roads that had been secure for generations, walls being hastily strengthened at cities that had felt no need of them before, references to shadowy enemies and unrest at the edges of the settled world. It is the texture of a civilization beginning, almost imperceptibly, to lose its grip, not yet falling, but no longer sure of itself, glancing over its shoulder, tightening its defences, feeling the first cold draught of something coming that it could not yet name. And there were other tremors. There are hints in the records of raiding and piracy on the sea, of ships that were not merchants, of enemies who came from the water, of coastal towns that needed defending. There are signs of movement, of peoples on the move, of pressure on the frontiers. There are references to trouble in various quarters, to rebellions, to breakdowns in the smooth functioning of the system. And running underneath it all, though the people of the time could not have measured it, the earth itself and the sky itself were turning against the golden world, the climate shifting, the rains failing, and, as we will see, the ground preparing to shake. None of these tremors, by itself, was necessarily fatal. The golden world had weathered bad harvests and raids and earthquakes and rebellions before, many times, across its long centuries, and had always recovered. That was the whole point of a rich, connected, resilient system. It could absorb shocks, share resources, help its members through hard times. A famine in one land could be relieved by grain from another. The system was built to survive trouble. What no one could have imagined, what had perhaps never happened before in the whole history of the world, was what happens when all the troubles come at once, when the shocks arrive together and compound one another, when the very connections that were supposed to provide resilience become instead the channels through which the collapse spreads. That is what was coming. The tremors were about to become the earthquake. And it began, as far as we can tell, with fire. Then, in the decades around 1200 before the Common Era, the fire came, and it came almost everywhere. This is the great fact at the heart of the collapse, the thing the archaeology shows beyond any doubt. Across the whole eastern Mediterranean, in a relatively short span of time, city after city after city was violently destroyed, burned, and in most cases never rebuilt. It is not one destruction. It is a whole horizon of destruction, a wave of fire that swept across the connected world from Greece to the Levant, leaving behind it that black band in the earth, the destruction layer that marks the end of the Bronze Age. Walk the map of the catastrophe, and the scale of it is staggering. In mainland Greece, the great Mycenaean citadels burned. Mycenae itself, Tyrans, Pylos, the palaces going up in flames and their kingdoms with them. On the islands, destruction. Along the coast of Anatolia, the great cities fell. Troy, in one of its incarnations, among them. Across Cyprus, rich cities were destroyed. Down the coast of the Levant, the ports and cities burned. Ugarit above all, but many others with it. Inland, the mighty Hittite Empire came apart, its capital abandoned and burned. In city after city, the same story in the ground. A thriving Bronze Age settlement, and then a layer of ash and destruction, and then either nothing at all, or a poorer, smaller, cruder settlement built later by different and humbler people. The great palaces are not just damaged, they are gone, and the sophisticated civilization they anchored is gone with them. And the ground remembers it with terrible precision. At Ugarit, the destruction layer is thick with arrowheads and slingstones, and the collapsed walls are scorched red where the heat was fiercest. The excavators found bronze weapons dropped in the streets and hordes of tools and treasure buried hastily beneath floors by people who meant to come back for them and never did. At the Mycenaean palace of Pylos, the fire was so intense that it did to the palace archive exactly what it did to the letter of Ugarit. It baked the clay tablets of the storerooms hard, preserving the last inventories of a kingdom that burned the very season those inventories were taken, so that we can read what was in the storerooms of Pylos on the last day of its life, the oil and the grain, and the bronze counted and recorded by scribes who had, though they did not know it, only days to live. At Hattusa, the Hittite capital, the great buildings show signs of having been stripped and abandoned before the burning, as if the people knew what was coming and carried away what they could. Everywhere the pattern repeats with small local variations, and everywhere it ends the same way, in a band of ash and fallen stone, and then a silence in the earth that lasts for generations. Archaeologists have a name for that band, the destruction layer. And to dig down through the earth of one of these sites is to read the collapse with your own hands. There is the rich, deep, complex habitation of the Bronze Age city, layer upon layer of prosperous life. And then, sharp and unmistakable, the black stratum of ash and burned debris and fallen mud brick, often a foot thick or more, studded sometimes with the arrowheads and slingstones of the final fight and the scattered possessions of people who fled or died. And then, above it, either nothing at all, or the thin, poor, crude traces of some much humbler people who crept back generations later to live among the ruins of a grandeur they did not build and could not match. That black line in the earth, repeated at site after site across 1,000 miles, is the signature of the Bronze Age collapse. The exact horizon where a world ended, written in charcoal and ash, readable 3,000 years later by anyone willing to dig down to it. What makes this so shocking is the completeness and the permanence of it. Cities are destroyed in war all the time throughout history, and usually they are rebuilt. The survivors return, the walls go back up, life resumes. That is the normal pattern. But this was different. This time, over and over, the cities were destroyed and stayed destroyed. The palaces fell and were never rebuilt. The whole way of life, the palace economy, the writing, the trade, the art, the kingship, did not recover. It vanished. This was not the ordinary destruction of war. It was the unmaking of a civilization, the permanent erasure of an entire way of organizing human life across an entire region. And it happened fast. Not over centuries of slow decline, but within the span of a single lifetime, perhaps only a few decades, the whole shining, interconnected world of the late Bronze Age going down in fire from end to end and not getting up again. The obvious question, the question that has haunted everyone who has ever studied this, is the one we will spend the deepest part of the night on. Who or what lit all those fires? And the first and most famous suspect, the one the ancient sources themselves point to, came from the sea. When the ancient Egyptians tried to explain the catastrophe that engulfed their world. For Egypt, uniquely, survived to write about it. They pointed to a single terrifying cause: invaders who came from the sea. On the walls of a great temple at a place called Medinet Habu, the pharaoh Ramesses III left an enormous inscription and a series of vivid battle reliefs describing a mortal struggle against a coalition of enemies he called, among other names, the peoples of the sea. And his description of what these sea peoples had already done before they reached Egypt is one of the most chilling passages to survive from the ancient world. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands, the Egyptian inscription declares. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. And then it names them, the great powers of the age, falling one by one before the onslaught. The land of the Hittites, it says, was destroyed. This place and that place cut off. And the enemy came on toward Egypt, the text says, with a flame prepared before them, moving across the world, a great confederation of peoples on the move, bringing destruction wherever they went. The reliefs show them. Warriors in strange, feathered headdresses, fighting from ships in a great sea battle, and, most hauntingly, moving not as a raiding army, but as a whole people on the move, with their women and children and possessions loaded into ox carts, migrating, it seems, in search of new land, leaving ruin in their wake. This was not a raid. This was a migration, an armed wandering of displaced peoples, crashing through the settled kingdoms of the old world like a wave. And the names the Egyptians gave these peoples have teased scholars ever since. Names that sound tantalizingly like places all around the Mediterranean, and that may hint at where the wanderers came from, though nothing is certain. Some of the names have been connected, more or less speculatively, to peoples of the Aegean, of Anatolia, of the central Mediterranean and its islands. Even, some have argued, to groups who would later settle and give their name to particular coasts and regions. One group among them, according to the Egyptian records, was eventually settled on the coast of the southern Levant after being defeated, and may be connected to a people who appear, later, in the pages of the Hebrew Bible. But the truth is that we do not securely know who the sea peoples were, or exactly where they came from, and this uncertainty is itself part of the mystery. A great wave of humanity, named but not truly known, appearing out of the chaos, smashing the old world, and then themselves largely vanishing into the resettled, reshuffled world that followed. For a long time, this was the answer to the mystery. The sea peoples did it. These mysterious marauders swept out of the north or the west, this coalition of displaced and desperate peoples, and they smashed the great powers one after another. The Hittites, the cities of the Levant, perhaps Mycenae itself, and finally hurled themselves against Egypt, where Ramesses III, in a desperate battle, barely managed to defeat them and save his kingdom. It is a dramatic, satisfying story, and it has a real basis in the evidence, something like it clearly did happen, and these moving, raiding peoples were clearly part of the catastrophe. But the more closely modern scholars have looked, the more the sea peoples have come to seem less like the cause of the collapse and more like one of its symptoms, less the disease than a fever the disease produced. For who were they, really? Where did they come from? And crucially, what had driven them from their own homes, set them wandering across the sea in search of new land in the first place? The people who destroy their neighbors because their own world has already collapsed are not the original cause of anything. They are refugees with weapons, the collapse spreading itself outward. And that is the deepest problem with blaming the sea peoples. To explain the collapse by the sea peoples, you first have to explain the sea peoples. And when you try, you find yourself right back inside the same mystery, looking for whatever it was that uprooted them too. Hold that thought. We will come back to it when we weigh all the suspects together. For now, follow the wave to the place where we began, to the last days of Ugarit. Of all the cities that died in the Great Collapse, none tells its own end as vividly as Ugarit, because Ugarit, the great literate merchant city, kept writing almost to the very last moment, and its final letters, baked hard in the fire of its destruction, let us stand inside a dying kingdom in a way almost nothing else in the ancient world allows. In the last archive of Ugarit, you can feel the world closing in. There are letters about ships that must be sent to the Hittite overlord, about troops called away to distant fronts, about grain shortages, about danger on the sea. The kingdom's forces, it seems, were scattered. Its army away supporting its Hittite masters, its ships requisitioned and gone, at exactly the moment it most needed to defend itself. And then come the final, desperate messages. There is a letter to the king of Ugarit from the king of a nearby land, or perhaps from an official, warning of enemy ships sighted, urging vigilance. And there is the reply, or something like it. That last letter we began with tonight, the king of Ugarit writing out his catastrophe even as it engulfed him. The enemy ships already here, 7 of them, the towns already burned, terrible things already done, the army away, the land defenseless. Does my father not know that all my troops are stationed in the Hittite country, and that all my ships are in the land of Lucca and have not yet returned? The country is abandoned to itself. Consider this, my father, there are 7 enemy ships that have come and done very great damage, and that is nearly the last we hear. The letters stop, because the writers stopped, because the city died. Archaeology confirms the story the letters tell. Ugarit was violently destroyed by fire around this time and, this is the crucial, terrible detail, it was never reoccupied. Unlike so many cities that fall and rise again, Ugarit fell and stayed fallen. The great cosmopolitan harbour, the crossroads of the world, the city of merchants and many languages and the early alphabet simply ended. Its people fled or died or scattered, and its ruins lay silent under the earth for 3,000 years, until archaeologists dug them up and found, among the ash and the collapsed walls, the baked clay tablets of that final archive. The business as usual of a prosperous city trailing off into fear, and then into the last unsent letter, and then into silence. In the ruins, the excavators read the ordinary life of the place frozen at the instant of its death. A kiln in a scribe's house still full of tablets waiting to be baked, meaning the last documents of Ugarit were being written in the final days, and had not even been fired when the fire that mattered came for them. The very ordinariness of those final tablets is what makes them so haunting. Not grand pronouncements, but the everyday business of a living city. A letter about a shipment, a note about a debt, a routine administrative record, the normal traffic of commerce and government continuing right up to the last hour, because the people of Ugarit did not know they were living the last hour. They expected another ordinary day to follow. They set their tablets in the kiln to bake as they had 1,000 times before, and went about their business, and the catastrophe found them mid-sentence, mid-transaction, mid-life, and froze it all exactly as it was. They found houses with their doors still barred from the inside, and beneath the floors the hoards. Jewelry, gold, bronze figurines of the gods, hidden by families who buried their wealth against the coming storm and never returned to reclaim it, so that the very presence of the treasure is proof that no one survived to dig it up. They found the great public buildings collapsed inward, the walls of the royal palace fallen in on the archives, and everywhere the same layer of ash and the same absence of any later life above it. Ugarit is the collapse made personal. It is one city's death, documented in its own words, and through it we can feel what the abstract phrase, the Bronze Age collapse, actually meant to the people who lived and died in it. The ships appearing on the horizon, the smoke rising from the towns, the desperate letter that could not be sent, and then the fire, and then nothing. And Ugarit's overlord, the mighty Hittite empire to which those troops and ships had been sent. It was dying too, in the same years, and its death was, if anything, even more complete. Remember Hattusa, the great Hittite capital high on the Anatolian plateau, the stronghold of one of the 2 superpowers of the age, the city of lion gates and vast archives, and a king who called the pharaoh brother. In the years of the collapse, it simply ceased to be, and the manner of its ending is one of the strangest and most revealing parts of the whole story. For a long time, the assumption was that Hattusa, like so many cities, was stormed and burned by enemies, by the sea peoples, perhaps, or by other invaders, and the city was indeed burned. But when archaeologists looked more closely, they found something unexpected and eerie. Before the fire, Hattusa appears to have been abandoned. The great capital was not caught by surprise and sacked in its prosperity. It seems to have been progressively emptied, its valuables removed, its royal archives and treasures taken away or secured, its population dwindling before the end. The impression is not of a thriving city struck down in a moment, but of a capital being deserted, wound down, given up, its people draining away before whatever final fire consumed the emptied shell. The heart of the empire was failing from within, even as the external threats gathered. And the empire that Hattusa ruled failed with it. The whole vast, sophisticated Hittite state. The law codes, the archives, the diplomacy, the army, the centuries of imperial power, dissolved. Not defeated in a single great battle, not conquered and absorbed by a rival, but dissolved, gone, its central authority evaporating, its territories fragmenting, its capital abandoned to the fire and then to the silence. And then came the forgetting, which is the most astonishing part of all. The Hittite Empire did not merely fall, it was erased from human memory almost completely. Within a few generations, no one remembered that a great empire had ruled Anatolia. The name of the Hittites survived only as a dim and puzzling reference in a few ancient texts, including the Hebrew Bible, where the Hittites appear as a shadowy people, and scholars for centuries had no idea these were the remnant of a vanished superpower. The location of Hattusa was utterly forgotten. The Hittite language was lost. The thousands of clay tablets in the mountain archives lay unread under the earth. An entire empire, the equal of Egypt, a state that had shaped the ancient world for centuries, simply fell out of history so completely that it had to be rediscovered, from nothing, by modern archaeologists digging into a Turkish hillside, deciphering a dead language, slowly reconstructing the existence of a superpower that the world had forgotten it ever had. The rediscovery reads like something out of a story. In the 19th century, travelers reported strange ruins and inscriptions in central Anatolia in a script no one could read. Scholars slowly realized that a great forgotten power had once ruled here. Then, at the beginning of the 20th century, excavators at the hillside village of Boğazköy struck the mother lode. An archive of thousands of clay tablets, the state records of a vanished empire, written in a language that was itself unknown. It took years of painstaking work before a scholar cracked it and made the astonishing discovery that the Hittite language was not some exotic isolate, but a member of the Indo-European family, kin to Greek and Latin and Persian, and distantly to English itself. That these forgotten god-kings had spoken a tongue related to half the languages of Europe. Tablet by tablet, the lost empire came back. Its treaties and its prayers, its royal annals and its diplomatic letters, the whole administrative memory of a superpower resurrected from the earth after 3,000 years of oblivion. And with it came something stranger than any treaty, the ordinary voices of a vanished people. The tablets preserve their laws, which are often surprisingly humane by the standards of the age, preferring compensation to mutilation. They preserve their medical and magical texts, their festival calendars, their myths of a storm god and a vanishing god of vegetation whose disappearance dries up the world until he is found and brought home. They preserve the instructions given to palace officials and temple servants, down to rules about who might handle the king's water and how carefully it must be strained. 3,000 years of total forgetting, and then, suddenly, all of it back. A whole civilization's paperwork, and through the paperwork, its mind. It is one of the great recoveries in the history of scholarship, and it is also a strange comfort inside this story of loss. Proof that what falls into oblivion is not always gone forever, that the earth keeps better records than memory does, and that patience and the right kind of curiosity can sometimes call a lost world back. If you want to feel the true depth of the Bronze Age collapse, how total it was, how completely it unmade the world it destroyed. Think of Hattusa, not just fallen, but forgotten so thoroughly that for 3,000 years humanity did not even know it had existed. And the same deep forgetting was falling, in these same years, over the citadels of Greece. When the collapse reached the Mycenaean world of Greece, it produced the deepest and longest darkness of all, a dark age so profound that it swallowed not just the palaces and the kings, but the very art of writing, and lasted so long that when the Greeks finally emerged from it, centuries later, they had forgotten their own past so completely that it had turned into myth. The Mycenaean palaces burned, as everything burned. Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, the great citadels going up one after another, their painted halls and their storerooms and their archives consumed. And because, as we saw, the Mycenaean world was the most centralized of all, with everything running through the palace, the fall of the palaces meant the fall of everything. The palace economy. The gathering and redistribution of grain and goods, the organization of labor and craft, the whole intricate system recorded in those linear B tablets, did not survive the destruction of its center. And so it all went. The wealth, the trade, the fine art, the monumental building, the kingship, and, most strikingly, the writing. Linear B, the script the Mycenaean scribes had used to keep the palace accounts, vanished utterly with the palaces it served. There was no longer any palace economy to record, and so there was no longer any writing, and the skill itself was lost. And it stayed lost for a very long time, something like 4 centuries. For 400 years, Greece was illiterate, poorer, emptier, its population fallen, its great sites abandoned or reduced to villages, its connections to the wider world largely severed. This is the Greek Dark Age, and it was genuinely dark, both to the people who lived through it and to us who try to see into it, for a society that does not write leaves little for the historian to find. The archaeology of those centuries is a study in subtraction. The fine painted pottery gives way to plainer, cruder wares. The great tombs give way to simple graves. The population, by every measure the excavators can find, falls steeply, whole districts emptying to a fraction of what they had held. The trade goods from distant lands, the ivory, the gold, the tin, simply stop appearing. People still lived and farmed and raised their children in the shadow of the ruined citadels, but they lived smaller, poorer, more isolated lives, and they built nothing that lasted, and they wrote nothing at all, and for 400 years the light of history goes very nearly out over the land that would one day give the world Athens. And yet the memory of the Golden Age did not vanish entirely, even in the dark. It went underground into song. Through those illiterate centuries, poets kept alive stories of a vanished heroic time, of kings with bronze armor and ships and vast wealth, of a great expedition across the sea against a rich city, of palaces and treasure and men greater than any now alive. Passed mouth to mouth, generation to generation, the tales grew and changed and gathered wonders. And when the Greeks finally learned to write again, borrowing an alphabet from Phoenician traders, almost the first thing they wrote down was that inheritance. The poems we know as the Iliad and the Odyssey, which describe, dimly and imperfectly and mixed with the poet's own age, the world that had fallen 4 centuries before. The Bronze Age spoke to the future in the only voice it had left. It sang. The memory of the Bronze Age world did not vanish entirely, but it survived only in the way memories survive in a world without writing, as spoken tales, told and retold and reshaped around the fire across the centuries, growing and changing and mythologizing as they went. And out of those centuries of oral retelling came, at last, the poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, written down when Greece had finally learned to write again, using a new alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians, having completely forgotten Linear B. Homer's poems are the Bronze Age remembered through 400 years of darkness. The great kings become heroes. The wars become epics, the real Mycenaean world half preserved and half transformed into a golden age of gods and heroes that the poets looked back on with longing. When the later Greeks, the Greeks of Athens and Sparta, of philosophy and democracy, thought about their own deep past, they thought about Homer's heroes, never knowing that behind the myth lay a real Bronze Age civilization that had truly existed and truly fallen, and whose fall had cast them into the darkness from which their whole classical world would eventually, slowly, climb. Only one of the great powers climbed out of the fire still standing, and even it was never the same again. Of all the great kingdoms of the Bronze Age, only one survived the collapse, Egypt. Alone among the brotherhood of great powers, Egypt did not vanish. It endured. But it endured, battered, diminished, and permanently changed. And the story of how narrowly it survived, and how much it lost in surviving, is the last chapter of the fall. The pharaoh who faced the storm was Ramesses III, and it was he who left, on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu, the great account of the war against the sea peoples. According to those inscriptions, the wave that had already destroyed the Hittites and the cities of the Levant came on at last toward Egypt, the coalition of peoples on the move, by land and by sea, with their carts and their families and their weapons, a whole world in migration crashing toward the Nile. And Ramesses met them in a great land battle and a great sea battle, and, according to his telling, defeated them in desperate fighting, and saved Egypt from the fate that had consumed the rest of the world. The reliefs show the Egyptian archers and the clashing ships and the enemy dead, and proclaim a total victory, the pharaoh as the savior who held back the chaos that had swallowed every other land. And Egypt did survive. That much is true. The sea peoples were turned back from the Nile. Egypt was not destroyed as the Hittite Empire was destroyed. But survival is not the same as victory, and the Egypt that came through the collapse was a shadow of the golden empire that had entered it. The effort of survival exhausted the kingdom. In the decades after Ramesses III, Egypt's power drained away. It lost its empire in the Near East, its influence abroad, its access to the trade of the wider world, which had, in any case, largely ceased to exist, since the connected world Egypt had traded with was gone. The central authority of the pharaohs weakened, the country fragmented. The great age of Egyptian power was over. Egypt would go on for many more centuries and would have moments of revival, but it would never again be what it had been in the golden age of the new kingdom. It had survived the collapse the way a person survives a terrible illness that leaves them permanently weakened, alive, but never again as strong. In the reigns after Ramesses III, the records tell of troubles that would have been unthinkable in the golden age. Of workers on the royal tombs going unpaid and downing their tools in what may be the first recorded strike in history, because the grain that was their wages did not arrive. The men who built the tombs of the pharaohs marching in the great necropolis at the place we call Deir el-Medina to sit down before the temples and refuse to work until they were fed, chanting that they were hungry, that 18 days of the month had passed with no rations. A scene of ordinary desperation that would have been unthinkable in the confident abundance of the Golden Age, of tomb robbing on a scale that spoke of desperation and the breakdown of order, of the priesthood growing so powerful that it rivaled and finally eclipsed the throne, of the country splitting, in time, into separate powers, north and south. The pharaohs who followed grew weaker, the empire abroad was lost, and Egypt turned inward, diminished, one survivor sitting amid the wreckage of a world that had otherwise ended. It lived, but the great age was over, and everyone who looked back on it knew that something enormous had been lost. Later, Egyptians would speak of the new kingdom the way people always speak of a golden age they have outlived, as a time of giants, of proper order, of kings who were truly kings, receding year by year into a brightness that could be admired but never reached again. And so, when the fires finally burned out and the wave finally spent itself, this was what remained of the golden world. The Hittite Empire gone and forgotten, the cities of the Levant burned, Ugarit silent forever, Mycenae fallen into a 400-year darkness, and Egypt alone still standing, exhausted and diminished, at the edge of a world that had ended. The connected world was finished. And now, before we ask the hardest question, why? Let the story rest again in the quiet after the fire. The story has walked now through the hardest part of the night, through the burning of the cities, the death of Ugarit, the vanishing of the Hittite Empire, the long darkness falling over Greece, the narrow and costly survival of Egypt. And it needs, as the traveller needs after hard walking, to sit down a while in the quiet and let the smoke clear before it turns to the great question of why. So the story turns away from the burning cities now to the quiet that came after. A year later, 5 years later, in one of the places where a great city had stood, the fire is long out, the smoke is long gone, the ruins have begun, already, to soften. grass growing up through the fallen stones, a vine finding its way across a collapsed wall, the sharp black edges of the burning weathering slowly to grey. Where the palace stood, where the great hall rang with feasting and the scribes pressed the day's accounts into clay, there is only tumbled stone and silence now, and the wind moving through it, and perhaps, somewhere nearby, a few poor huts where a handful of people, the descendants of the survivors or newcomers who drifted in after, live small, quiet lives among the bones of the vanished greatness, keeping goats, growing a little grain, no longer building in stone, no longer writing, no longer trading with distant lands, no longer remembering, after a generation or two, that any of it had ever been. There is a strange peace in that after quiet, and it is worth resting in, because it is the truest picture of what a collapse actually is. We imagine catastrophe as noise and fire and screaming, and it is those things, for a while. But mostly a collapse is what comes after the noise, the long silence, the slow greening of the ruins, the small lives lived among the wreckage of the great ones, the forgetting. The people living in those huts among the fallen stones were not, most of them, in agony. They were just living. Poorer, smaller, simpler lives than their grandparents had lived, in a world that had contracted from the wide connected sea to the near horizon of a single valley, but living nonetheless, keeping their goats, raising their children, watching the sun go down behind the ruined walls of a greatness they no longer even had a name for. The world had ended, and the world had gone on, in the way it always does, quieter and poorer and smaller, the grass growing up through the ash. Let the story rest there a while, in that softened quiet among the greening ruins, in the long calm after the fire. For there is a kind of gentleness in it, the gentleness of an ending fully arrived and accepted, the wind in the fallen stones, the goats on the hillside, the great silence where the palace was. When the story rises again, it will turn at last to the detective's question, the question that has waited all night. What did this? But that question can wait a little longer. For now there is only the quiet after fire, and the grass in the ruins, and the small lives going on, and the slow grey weathering of everything that was under a wide and indifferent sky. And so we come to the heart of the night, the hole at the centre, the question that has drawn us through the whole long story. What destroyed the Bronze Age world? We have seen the Golden Age, and we have seen it fall, and now, in the deep of the night, we do the honest and difficult thing. We sit down with all the evidence and all the suspects, and we try to solve the crime. And the first thing that has to be said, the thing that makes this the greatest of ancient mysteries, is why it is so hard. Why 100 years of brilliant investigation has not produced a confident answer. For more than a century, brilliant minds have proposed solution after solution, each in its turn declared the answer, each in its turn found wanting. It was the sea peoples, said the early scholars, following the Egyptian inscriptions, until it became clear the sea peoples were themselves a symptom. It was the Dorian invasion, said others, a supposed influx of new Greeks from the north, until the evidence for such an invasion dissolved under scrutiny. It was earthquakes, it was drought, it was the coming of iron, it was internal rebellion, it was a change in warfare, a new kind of infantry overthrowing the old chariot aristocracies. It was systems collapse, it was climate. Each theory has had its champions and its decades of fashion, and each has explained part of the evidence brilliantly and then broken against the rest. The very abundance of good theories is itself the deepest clue of all, because when 100 years of serious investigation produces not one answer but a dozen partial ones, none able to defeat the others, the likeliest explanation is not that everyone has been wrong, but that everyone has been partly right. The problem is this. When a single city falls, you can usually find a single cause. This army came, that earthquake struck, this king was betrayed. But the Bronze Age collapse was not a single event. It was the near-simultaneous failure of an entire interconnected civilization across an enormous area. Dozens of kingdoms and cities, from Greece to the Levant, falling within a few decades of one another. And no ordinary single cause is big enough to do that. An invading army, however fierce, does not by itself explain why cities 1,000 miles apart all fell at once and stayed fallen. An earthquake, however violent, destroys a region, not a civilization. A drought starves people but does not usually erase the very knowledge of writing. Each ordinary explanation, when you hold it up against the sheer scale and totality and permanence of what happened, is too small. The catastrophe is bigger than any of its proposed causes. And there is a second, subtler problem, which we noticed earlier and now must face directly. Every single cause theory explains some of the evidence and fails on the rest. Blame the sea peoples, and you explain the burned coastal cities and the Egyptian battle reliefs. But you cannot explain what drove the sea peoples themselves from their homes, and you cannot explain the drought written in the ancient pollen, and you cannot explain the cities destroyed far inland where no sea raider reached. Blame the earthquakes, and you explain some fallen walls, but not the cities with weapons and arrowheads in the ash, which speak of human violence, not falling stone. Blame the drought, and you explain the desperate letters begging for grain, but not why strong, fortified palaces fell so fast and so completely. Every theory is a key that turns some of the locks and jams in the others. And this is the crucial clue, the thing the frustration itself is trying to tell us. When no single suspect can have done the whole crime, when each suspect has an alibi for part of it, the answer is usually not that we have failed to find the real single culprit. The answer is that there was no single culprit. The crime was committed by all of them together. And this is why the Bronze Age collapse holds such a powerful grip on everyone who studies it. Not despite its resistance to a simple answer, but because of it. It is a genuine mystery of the deepest kind, one where the evidence is real and abundant, and yet refuses to resolve into a single tidy solution, one where the more you learn, the more you appreciate the true complexity of what happened. It is history's great lesson in humility, a reminder that the largest events do not always have the simplest explanations, that a whole world can die without any single thing having killed it, and that honesty sometimes means holding several partial truths at once rather than collapsing them into one false certainty. So let us bring in the suspects, one by one, and hear the case against each, and watch how each one, though guilty, turns out to be too small to have done it alone. The first suspect is the earth. And there is a real and startling case to be made that the ground itself rose up against the Bronze Age world, because the decades of the collapse appear to have been a time of extraordinary seismic violence, what some scientists have called an earthquake storm. The eastern Mediterranean is one of the most earthquake-prone regions on the planet, sitting where great plates of the Earth's crust grind against one another. And earthquakes, geologists have come to understand, do not always come at random. Sometimes, when a series of connected faults begins to slip, one great earthquake can load stress onto the next fault along, triggering another and another in a sequence that can play out over years or decades. A storm of earthquakes marching along a fault system, region after region. And when scientists and archaeologists looked at the physical evidence in the ruins of the Bronze Age cities, they found, in site after site, the unmistakable signatures of earthquake destruction dated to right around the time of the collapse. Walls toppled in characteristic ways, columns fallen in the same direction, human bodies crushed beneath collapsed buildings and never recovered. The specific fingerprints of seismic catastrophe. From Greece to Anatolia to the Levant, the same period shows the marks of major earthquakes. At Mycenae and Tiryns, archaeologists found walls thrown down and, in places, the crushed skeletons of people caught beneath falling stone. A woman and child killed in a doorway at Tiryns, buried where they fell, never dug out by any survivor. At other Greek sites, the excavators found bodies left where they died in the collapse, hastily and incompletely buried or not buried at all, which is itself a terrible sign. For a functioning society tends its dead, and only a society that has itself broken down leaves them lying in the ruins. The dead of the earthquakes are, in that sense, doubly eloquent. They tell us that the ground shook, and they tell us that whatever came after the shaking was chaotic enough that no one came back to bury them properly. At other sites, the excavators noted columns and pillars all toppled in the same direction, the way a hard tremor throws them, and repairs made hastily after one shock only to be thrown down again by the next. The picture that emerges is of cities struck not once but repeatedly, a drumbeat of quakes falling on a world that had no respite between the blows. It genuinely appears that in the very decades the world was falling, a run of great earthquakes rippled across the whole region, shaking down cities and palaces from one end of the connected world to the other. Consider what that would do to a fragile, stressed civilization. A great earthquake does not merely knock down buildings. It shatters the defensive walls that protect a city precisely when it most needs protection. It destroys the storehouses and spoils the grain. It ruins the palace that organizes everything. It kills people and terrifies the survivors, and breaks the confidence that lets a society function. A city already anxious with famine and raiding, already stretched thin, could be pushed over the edge by an earthquake. Its walls thrown down, its defenders killed, its stores ruined, and left helpless before whatever enemy came next. So the earthquakes are a real and powerful suspect, and they surely played their part. But, and here is the pattern again, they cannot be the whole answer. Earthquakes are terrible, but civilizations recover from earthquakes. The region had been shaken many times before across its long history and had always rebuilt. And earthquakes do not explain the arrowheads in the ash, or the peoples on the move, or the great drought. The earth shook the world and helped to bring it down. But the earth had shaken it before, and it had risen again. Something more was needed to make the fall permanent. Look next, then, to the sky. The second suspect leaves no toppled walls, no arrowheads, no dramatic reliefs. But it may be the deepest and most powerful cause of all, and modern science has only in recent decades been able to convict it. The suspect is the climate itself, a great drought, a long and punishing failure of the rains that fell across the eastern Mediterranean in exactly the decades of the collapse. How can we possibly know about the weather 3,000 years ago? This is one of the quiet triumphs of modern science. The climate of the ancient past leaves traces if you know how to read them. In the pollen preserved in the mud at the bottom of lakes, layer by layer, year by year, recording which plants grew and therefore how wet or dry each period was. In the chemistry of ancient sediments and cave formations, in the isotopes locked in old shells and bone, in the growth rings of ancient trees. And when scientists gathered these records from across the eastern Mediterranean and read the climate written in them, they found the same thing again and again. Right around the time of the collapse, the region entered a period of severe, prolonged drought. The rains failed. The climate shifted colder and drier. For decades, across the whole region, there was not enough water and not enough food. The pollen records show the farmland shrinking, the vegetation changing, the long dry gripping the land. And this was not a single failed harvest, the kind any farming society expects and stores against. It was a shift in the climate itself, sustained across decades, generation upon generation of thinner rains and lower rivers and shrinking fields. Long enough that the reserves ran out, that the stored grain was eaten, that the margins that had let societies survive the occasional bad year were ground away, until there was nothing left between the people and the hunger. A society can survive one dry year, or 3, on what it has put by. It cannot survive a lifetime of them. And the drought did not fall on a world that could easily move to escape it. These were societies rooted in place, tied to their fields, their irrigation works, their cities, their temples, the graves of their ancestors. Not nomads who could simply follow the rain. When the rain failed across the whole region at once, there was nowhere within reach that was not also failing. No neighboring land of plenty to migrate to, because the drought was continental in scale. A farmer whose field died could not simply walk to a wetter valley, because the wetter valley was dying too. The only lands still reliably fed. Egypt above all, watered by its faraway river, lay across seas and deserts, guarded and full, and could absorb only so many of the desperate. So the drought penned its victims in, tightening year by year, with no exit, until the pressure had nowhere to go but into movement, into raiding, into the violent unravelling of the settled order itself. And that, the science suggests, is what the late Bronze Age faced. Not a bad season, but a bad age. The slow closing of a dry hand around the whole connected world. And suddenly a great deal of the evidence snaps into focus. Remember the anxious letters of the last years, the kings writing not about gifts now, but about grain, about famine, about the desperate need to feed their people. Remember the Hittite Empire on its high, dry plateau, unable to feed itself, ordering grain shipped in, sliding toward hunger. Remember Egypt, which alone survived. Egypt, whose food did not depend on the rains at all, but on the flooding of the Nile, fed by faraway sources beyond the reach of the Mediterranean drought. The pattern fits with terrible elegance. A great drought falls across the connected world. The harvests fail year after year. Famine grips the land. The kingdoms that depend on the rains begin to starve, while Egypt, fed by its river, alone holds on. Drought does not burn cities, but drought does something perhaps worse. It starves societies from within. It empties the storehouses, breeds desperation, drives people from their failing farms, sets whole populations moving in search of food, turns neighbor against neighbor and kingdom against kingdom in the scramble for shrinking resources. A drought could set the whole world in motion, could uproot the peoples who became the sea peoples, could weaken every kingdom at once, could turn a stable, connected world into a powder keg. The drought is, to many scholars, the deepest single cause, the slow, strangling pressure underneath everything else. And yet, the pattern holds once more. Even the drought is not quite enough by itself. Droughts, too, had come before. Societies endure famine and recover. Drought explains the hunger and the movement, but not by itself. The fire and the arrowheads, and the sudden violent end of the fortified palaces. It is the great underlying pressure. But pressure needs a trigger, and the hunger the drought produced brings us to the next suspect. The third suspect is the one the drought produced, and the one the last letters cry out about most directly: famine. Simple, grinding hunger, the failure of the food, the starving of a civilization. We have heard the letters already, but sit with what they mean. In the final years, the correspondence of the great powers turns, with rising panic, to grain. The Hittite king writes that it is a matter of life and death, that the grain must be sent, that his land hungers. Ships are dispatched carrying emergency grain across the sea. Kings who once wrote about gold and marriages now write about bread. One Hittite document speaks of sending grain by ship to feed a starving population and stresses that it is a matter of survival. An Egyptian pharaoh, in an inscription, boasts of having sent grain to keep the land of the Hittites alive, as though the feeding of a former rival superpower had become an act worth carving in stone. When the greatest kingdoms of the age are reduced to begging one another for food and boasting about famine relief, the abstraction called the Bronze Age collapse reveals its true face. It was, among everything else it was, a very long and very wide hunger. This is the drought made human. The abstract climate shift turned into empty storehouses and hungry children and desperate kings. And hunger, more than almost anything, unmakes a society. A well-fed people can endure a great deal. War, earthquake, hardship, and hold together. A starving people cannot. Hunger breaks the bonds that hold a civilization together faster and more surely than any army. It drives the farmer from his failing field. It turns the loyal subject into a desperate one. It sets the hungry region raiding the region that still has food. It sends whole peoples migrating across the world in search of something to eat. It hollows out the strength of a kingdom from the inside, so that when the blow finally comes, the earthquake, the raiders, the enemy at the gate, there is no strength left to resist it. And famine has a special power to turn a local disaster into a spreading one, precisely because of the connectedness that made the Bronze Age world so rich. In good times, the trade network moved grain from where there was surplus to where there was need, and that sharing made everyone more secure. But a great drought does not strike one kingdom, it strikes them all at once. And when everyone is hungry at the same time, the network that once shared food becomes a network that spreads panic and competition instead. The kingdom with a little grain hoards it. The trade routes, which carried plenty in good years, now carry desperate raiders and refugees. The very connections that made the system strong become the channels through which the hunger and the chaos spread. Famine, in a connected world, is contagious. And famine does something else, something that turns a hard season into the end of a world. It destroys the future as well as the present. A starving family eats its seed grain, the grain it should have planted for next year, because it must eat something now, and in doing so it mortgages the coming harvest to survive the present one, so that even if the rains return, there is nothing to sow. A starving kingdom sells or eats its breeding animals and cannot easily rebuild the herds. A starving society loses its craftsmen and its specialists, who die or scatter or turn to scavenging, and with them goes the accumulated skill of generations. Hunger, sustained long enough, does not merely thin a population. It eats the very capacity of a society to recover, hollowing out the seed corn of its future along with the bread of its present, so that a people can be pushed past a point from which no good year, however plentiful, can bring them back. So the hunger is a powerful suspect, and it links the drought above it to the violence below it. It is the mechanism by which a failure of the rains becomes a collapse of civilization. But hunger, too, is not quite the final answer, because hunger is a cause of desperation, and desperation still needs somewhere to go. But before following the hunger out onto the roads and the sea, there is one more suspect to hear. One that leaves almost no trace in the ruins, and that travels, as it happens, along exactly the same routes as the grain and the copper and the tin. The next suspect is the hardest of all to convict, because it burns no cities, throws down no walls, and leaves almost nothing an excavator can point to. It is disease, epidemic sickness moving through a hungry, crowded, connected world. And while the case against it is thin, the case is not nothing, and it is worth hearing honestly, because it may have been one of the quiet weights on the scale. Start with the one place the ancient record speaks plainly. Among the Hittite archives, there survives a set of documents known as the Plague Prayers, written by a king named Mursili, and they are among the most human texts to come down to us from the Bronze Age. A terrible sickness had come into the Hittite land, brought back, the king believed, by soldiers returning from a campaign in Egyptian territory, and it had raged, by his own account, for 20 years, killing so many that the land was emptied, the fields untended, the rites of the gods left unperformed for want of men to perform them. Mursili writes to his gods in something close to despair. He asks what his people have done to deserve it. He searches the old records and concludes that his own father broke a sacred oath and that the plague is the punishment, and he offers to make restitution, and he pleads, again and again, for the sickness to be lifted. Reading it 3,000 years later, one is struck less by the theology than by the ordinary human sound of it. A ruler watching his country die of something he cannot see, cannot fight, and cannot explain, casting about for a reason. That plague came a century or so before the Great Collapse, and it did not destroy the Hittite Empire. The empire recovered and went on to its greatest strength. But it demonstrates something important, that the connected world was also, inevitably, a connected disease network. The same ships and caravans and armies that carried tin and copper and grain and diplomacy carried sickness as well, and a plague that began in one corner of the system could ride the trade routes into every other. And it demonstrates what such an event does to a state. Emptying the fields of laborers, thinning the armies, breaking the routine of administration, striking exactly the manpower on which a palace economy depends. Now consider the conditions of the collapse years. A population weakened by decades of poor harvests and malnutrition is a population with lowered resistance to infection. Refugees on the move, crowded into camps or besieging cities or packed onto ships, are ideal conditions for an epidemic. Armies marching, cities filling with the displaced, sanitation breaking down, the dead sometimes left unburied in the ruins. Every one of these is a condition that disease exploits. It would be surprising, in truth, if epidemics had not moved through the collapsing world. Famine and pestilence have walked together in every documented catastrophe of later history, and there is no particular reason the Bronze Age should have been the exception. And yet the honest verdict has to be a cautious one. We have no direct evidence of a great pandemic at the moment of the collapse itself. No mass graves, clearly attributable to plague across the fallen world. No chorus of texts describing a great sickness in the final decades. Ancient epidemics are notoriously hard to see archaeologically. Most infectious diseases leave no mark on bone, and the written record for these particular years is precisely the record that was breaking down. Modern science is beginning to change this, as researchers learn to recover the genetic traces of ancient pathogens from teeth and bone, and it is possible that future work will find what the excavators of the last century could not. But as things stand, Disease is a suspect with motive and opportunity and almost no physical evidence. A plausible amplifier of the catastrophe rather than a proven cause of it. One more pressure that may well have been pushing on a world already bending under all the rest. Set it on the scale with the others. Weight it honestly and lightly. And follow the hunger and the fear back out onto the roads. Because where the desperation of that dying world finally went was into movement, into violence, into the wave of displaced and armed humanity that the Egyptians called the peoples of the sea. So we come back to the sea peoples. The first and most famous suspect, the marauders from the water, the coalition that the Egyptians blamed for the destruction of the world. But we come back to them now with new eyes, having met the other suspects, and we can see them at last for what they most likely were. Not the cause of the collapse, but its most violent symptom. The drought and the hunger and the chaos given ships and weapons and set loose upon the world. Think again about what the Egyptian reliefs actually show. Not a disciplined foreign army invading for conquest, but a whole people on the move. Warriors, yes, fighting from ships, but also women and children and possessions loaded into ox carts, migrating, wandering, looking for somewhere to live. That is not the picture of an aggressor. That is the picture of a refugee crisis with weapons. On the temple walls at Medinet Habu, where the pharaoh Rameses III recorded his great battle against them, the carvers showed the enemy in revealing detail. Warriors in strange, feathered headdresses fighting from their ships, yes. But behind and among them, lumbering ox carts piled high with women, children, and household goods, the solid two-wheeled wagons of a people carrying everything they owned because they had nowhere left to go back to. A raiding fleet does not bring its children and its furniture. A migration does. The Egyptians drew, without quite understanding it, the portrait of a people who had lost their homeland and were looking, with weapons in hand, for another. And the names the Egyptians gave these peoples are themselves a puzzle and a clue. The inscriptions list a coalition of many groups: the Peliset, the Sherden, the Sheklesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, and others. Foreign-sounding names that scholars have spent lifetimes trying to match to known places. Some may echo later peoples. The Peliset are very likely the Philistines, who would settle the coast of the Levant and give their name, eventually, to Palestine. The Sherden may be connected to Sardinia, the Sheklesh perhaps to Sicily. If those identifications hold, then the Sea Peoples were not one nation, but a great churning confederation drawn from all around the Mediterranean. A whole sea's worth of displaced and desperate peoples, thrown together by catastrophe, moving as one great armed migration toward the last rich lands still standing. That is not an invasion in the ordinary sense. That is a world coming apart and its fragments crashing together. Something had driven these people from their own homes, and what could drive whole peoples to abandon their lands and set out across the sea into the unknown, fighting for survival as they went, if not the very things we have been describing? The drought that killed their crops, the famine that emptied their storehouses, the collapse of their own local worlds? The Sea Peoples were very likely themselves victims of the catastrophe. Populations from somewhere in the north or west whose own societies had failed, uprooted by hunger and disorder, forced into a desperate armed migration in search of land that could still feed them. And as they moved, they became a cause of collapse for others, smashing into the already weakened kingdoms in their path, burning the cities, tipping over the palaces that drought and earthquake had already undermined, spreading the chaos outward like a wave. This is why the Sea Peoples are such a perfect illustration of the whole mystery. They are cause and effect at once, victim and destroyer, symptom and agent. They did not start the collapse. Something uprooted them first. But once uprooted, they carried the collapse to others, and those others, uprooted in turn, may have swelled the wandering hordes, so that the disaster fed on itself, growing as it spread, a chain reaction of displaced and desperate humanity crashing across the connected world. Blaming the Sea Peoples for the Bronze Age collapse is like blaming the falling dominoes for the fall. They were part of the mechanism, but they were pushed before they pushed. And if the invaders from the sea were themselves victims, driven by forces that had already begun to unmake the world, then we are pushed to look harder at those deeper forces, and, uncomfortably, to look inside the golden world itself, at the possibility that some of the fire that consumed it was kindled not by any foreign enemy at all, but from within. There is one more suspect to bring in before we assemble the whole picture, and it is the most uncomfortable of all, because it does not come from outside. Not from the sea, not from the sky, not from the shaking earth, but from inside the golden world itself, from the very structure of the societies that fell. The suspect is the palace system and the people who lived beneath it, and the possibility that when the great houses burned, some of the hands that lit the fires belonged not to foreign raiders but to the palace's own people. Consider again how these societies were built. The palace sat at the center of everything, gathering the grain, controlling the trade, organizing the labor, redistributing the wealth, holding the writing and the reckoning in its own hands. It was a system of enormous inequality and enormous dependence. The great mass of people, the farmers, the herders, the craftsmen, the rowers, the laborers, produced the surplus, and the palace took it in and gave back what it chose to give. In the good years, this was a bargain of sorts. The palace provided security, order, storage against famine, the organization that made the whole rich world possible. But it was a bargain that depended entirely on the palace keeping its side, on the storehouses being full, on the redistribution actually happening, on the system delivering the security it promised. And when the bad years came, when the drought struck and the harvests failed and the storehouses emptied and the grain ships were seized by raiders and the trade that fed the system broke down, the palace could no longer keep its side of the bargain. It could no longer feed its people, or protect them, or deliver the security that was its whole reason to exist. And a system built on such total dependence, when it fails, does not fail gently. We cannot prove what happened inside the dying kingdoms, because the people who might have told us were not the ones who wrote. But there are hints, and there is a growing suspicion among those who study the collapse that in at least some of the burned cities, the fire came from below. That the farmers and laborers and slaves, starving, betrayed by a palace that could no longer feed or protect them, and perhaps inspired by the chaos spreading across the whole world, rose up against the great houses that had taken their grain for generations, and burned them, and walked away from the whole system that had bound them. It would explain some things that foreign raiders do not, why the palaces, so often, were the specific targets, why the destruction was so complete and so permanent, why no one rebuilt the old order, why the survivors seemed almost to turn their backs on the palace way of life and never return to it. When a foreign enemy sacks a city, the survivors usually rebuild the same kind of city. But when a people rejects the system itself, when the very idea of the palace has become hateful, they do not rebuild it. They let it lie in ash and build something smaller and freer and poorer in its place. Something like that seems to have happened across the fallen world. Not just the destruction of particular palaces, but the abandonment of the whole palace idea, the refusal to put the old machine back together. Whether the people burned the palaces themselves or simply declined to rebuild what the raiders and the earthquakes had thrown down, the result was the same. A world that did not want its old masters back. And this points us toward the deepest theory of all, the one that gathers up all the suspects into a single, terrible shape. The idea that the Bronze Age world was not murdered by any one killer, but died of its own complexity. A system so intricate and so interdependent that it could not survive the failure of its parts. Here is the suspect that has most troubled and fascinated modern thinkers, because it is the one that implicates not the earthquakes or the drought or the invaders, but the very structure of the Golden World itself. The idea that the Bronze Age civilization collapsed because of what it was, that its greatest strength was also its fatal weakness, that the machine broke itself. Remember the deepest truth about that world. It was the first age of globalization, a single, vast, interconnected system in which every kingdom depended on the others for the most essential materials of survival. No bronze without tin from the Far East and copper from Cyprus. No wealth without the trade routes. No stability without the whole network of kings and messengers and ships and caravans functioning together. This connectedness was the source of the world's astonishing richness and sophistication. It was also, it turns out, the source of a hidden and terrible fragility. Because a system in which everyone depends on everyone is a system that can fail all at once. In a world of isolated, self-sufficient communities, a disaster in one place stays in one place. The others are untouched and can even help the stricken region recover. But in a tightly connected system, where each part relies on all the others, a serious failure anywhere can cascade everywhere. Cut the tin roots, and every kingdom loses its bronze at once. Break the trade network, and the wealth of every city collapses together. Knock out enough of the connections, and the whole interdependent structure comes down. Not because any single part was weak, but because the connections themselves, which made the system strong, also made it brittle. This is what students of complex systems call systems collapse, and the Bronze Age world may be its most dramatic example in all of history. Picture the golden system under mounting stress. The drought reducing every kingdom's food, the earthquakes shattering key cities, the famine breeding desperation, the raiders cutting the trade routes. Each of these, alone, the resilient network might have absorbed. But together, striking a system whose every part depended on every other, they could trigger a cascade. A few key nodes fail, and because everything is connected, their failure pulls down the nodes that depended on them, which pull down the next, and the collapse propagates through the network faster than anyone can understand or stop it, until the whole interconnected civilization, the trade, the palaces, the kingship, the writing, the art, comes down together in a single generation, not because it was attacked by something big enough to destroy it, but because it was built in a way that let a combination of ordinary disasters tear it apart from within. The very interconnection that made the Uluburun ship possible. Baltic amber and Egyptian gold and Afghan tin on one deck was the interconnection that let the collapse run from Greece to the Levant like fire along a fuse. The world was a magnificent machine of many interlocking parts, and when enough of the parts failed at once, the machine did not limp undamaged. It flew apart. Think of how it might have run, node by node. A palace in Greece depends on trade for the tin to arm its soldiers and the luxuries that display its power. That trade depends on the ships that cross the sea. Those ships depend on safe harbors and paying customers at the other end. Let the customers, a Levantine city, say, burn, and the ships have nowhere to sell. Let piracy rise on the sea, and the ships stop sailing. Let the tin stop arriving, and the palace cannot arm its men. Let the palace weaken, and the whole local economy it organizes begins to fail, and its own people grow restless and hungry, and its neighbors, equally stressed, turn from trading partners into rivals for shrinking resources. Each failure makes the next more likely. Each broken connection puts more strain on the ones still holding, until they break too. This is how a system collapses, not all at once by a single blow, but in a spreading cascade, a chain of failures each triggered by the last, running through the whole network faster than anyone living inside it could see or understand or stop. This, more than any single villain, may be the real answer. And it is a deeply unsettling one, because it means the catastrophe was not an accident that befell the golden world from outside, but a possibility that was built into its very success. And there is one more suspect to consider, quieter than the others, working over a longer time, the metal itself and the new metal that came after. The last suspect is the strangest, because it is not a disaster at all, but an invention. And it may have been less a cause of the collapse than a consequence of it, and a reason it became permanent. The suspect is iron. For all the centuries of the Bronze Age, bronze had been the master metal, and bronze, as we have seen, depended utterly on long-distance trade, on the rare tin that had to travel thousands of miles to meet the copper. This gave enormous power to whoever controlled the trade routes and the supply, and it bound the whole world together in the network that made bronze possible. But there was another metal, harder to work but far more common: iron. The ore of iron is found almost everywhere, unlike the rare tin. The difficulty was never in finding it, but in working it. For iron requires much higher temperatures and a more sophisticated technique than bronze, and for most of the Bronze Age, iron working remained rare, difficult, and reserved for special objects. The pharaoh Tutankhamun was buried with a dagger of iron so precious that its blade was almost certainly worked from a fallen meteorite. Iron from the sky, rarer than gold, a treasure fit for a god king, at a time when no one could yet reliably smelt it from ordinary ore. That a king of mighty Egypt should treasure a single iron blade as a wonder tells you exactly how exotic the metal still was in the height of the Bronze Age. The secret was not the ore, which lay in the ground almost everywhere. The secret was the fire and the skill, the knowledge of how to heat it hot enough and hammer it and add just enough carbon to turn brittle iron into usable steel. Worked poorly, iron is actually inferior to good bronze, softer, more prone to rust, harder to cast into fine shapes. This is precisely why bronze had reigned so long. As long as the tin flowed, bronze was simply the better metal, and no one had strong reason to struggle with the difficult craft of iron. It was scarcity, not superiority, that finally drove the change. Necessity taught the smiths, over generations, to master the higher heat and the hammering and the carburizing that turned cheap, common, stubborn iron into steel that could hold an edge better than any bronze. And once that knowledge spread, there was no going back, because now the best metal was also the most abundant, and a weapon no longer depended on a thread of trade reaching across the whole world. As long as the bronze trade functioned, there was little reason to master the harder craft of iron. Bronze worked, the tin flowed, the system held. But when the collapse came, and the trade routes broke, and the tin stopped flowing, bronze suddenly became scarce and precious and hard to obtain. And in that new world, the incentive to master iron became overwhelming. If you could no longer get the tin to make bronze, you had to find another way to make tools and weapons, and iron, whatever its difficulties, had one supreme advantage. The ore was everywhere, in your own ground, dependent on no distant trade route, no far-off mine, no vulnerable network. And so, in the centuries after the collapse, ironworking spread and improved until iron replaced bronze as the master metal, and the world entered what we call the Iron Age. In this sense, iron did not cause the collapse. The collapse caused the widespread adoption of iron. But iron also helped make the collapse permanent, and helped ensure that the old connected world would never come back. Because a world armed with iron, with its locally available ore, no longer needed the vast trade network that bronze had required. The great globalized system of the Bronze Age had been held together, in part, by the sheer necessity of moving tin across the world. Iron dissolved that necessity. Once you could make your weapons from the ore beneath your own feet, you no longer needed the brotherhood of kings, the messengers, the tin caravans, the whole fragile web of long-distance dependence. The Iron Age world that slowly rose from the ashes was a different kind of world. More local, more self-sufficient, less gorgeously interconnected, and in that specific way, less fragile. The collapse killed the connected world. Iron made sure it stayed dead by removing the very need that had created it. And so we have met all the suspects. It remains only to bring them together and to say, as honestly as we can, what really happened. So who killed the Bronze Age world? We have interrogated every suspect. The shaking earth, the withholding sky, the grinding hunger, the unseen sickness, the wandering invaders, the fire kindled from within, the fatal fragility of the connected system, the coming of iron. And we have found the same thing about each of them, guilty and yet too small to have done it alone. And that, in the end, is the answer. Not one of them did it. All of them did it. Together. This is the honest solution to the great mystery. And it is stranger and more sobering than any single villain would be. The Bronze Age world did not fall because one terrible thing happened to it. It fell because many terrible things happened to it at once, and because they struck a system uniquely vulnerable to exactly that kind of combined assault. Picture the sequence, not as certainty, for we cannot have certainty, but as the shape the evidence suggests. A great drought settles over the whole eastern Mediterranean, and for decades the harvests fail. Famine grips the connected world. The storehouse is empty. The desperate letters fly. The hunger sets whole peoples in motion, uprooted from their failing lands, and some of them take to their ships and their ox carts and become the wandering, raiding sea peoples, carrying chaos wherever they go. Meanwhile, a storm of earthquakes ripples along the fault lines, shaking down the walls and palaces of cities already weakened by hunger. And all of this strikes a civilization whose every part depends on every other, whose strength is entirely in its connections. So that as the key cities fall and the trade routes break and the tin stops flowing, the failures cascade through the network, each collapse triggering the next, until the whole interdependent system comes apart in a single devastating generation, and the fire runs from Greece to the Levant, and the golden world is simply gone. And weave into that sequence the other strands we have gathered, sickness moving along the same roads as the grain, thinning the fields and the armies of states already staggering. The chariot aristocracies discovering at exactly the wrong moment that their glittering and expensive military supremacy could be undone by masses of hungry men on foot with javelins. And, inside the walls, populations who had given their harvests to the palace for generations in exchange for protection and bread, now receiving neither and turning at last on the great houses themselves, or simply walking away from them and declining, when it was over, to build them again. Each of these is a thread. No thread alone is strong enough to strangle a civilization. Woven together, in the same handful of decades, they are. And then iron, rising from the wreckage, ensures it can never be rebuilt, because the world that comes after no longer needs the fragile web that the old world was. No single one of these forces could have destroyed the Bronze Age world. A drought alone, it would have survived. An earthquake storm alone, it would have rebuilt from. A plague alone, it had survived before, as the Hittites survived the great sickness of Mursili's reign. The sea peoples alone, it might have repelled, as Egypt did. But all of them together, striking a brittle, over-connected, overstressed system in the same handful of decades, that was more than any civilization could bear. It was a perfect storm, in the truest sense, a convergence of separate catastrophes, each amplifying the others, adding up to something far greater than the sum of its parts. And we must be honest, at the very end, about the limits of even this answer. We do not know the exact sequence. We do not know the precise weight of each cause, or how they varied from region to region, or which struck first in any given place. The hole at the center of the story is real, and it does not fully close, and anyone who tells you they have solved the Bronze Age collapse completely, and certainly is claiming more than the evidence allows. And we should be honest, too, that the balance of causes may have differed from place to place. In one region, the earthquakes may have struck the decisive blow. In another, it may have been the raiders. In another, the slow strangling of the drought and the famine. In another, simply the failure of the trade the local economy could not live without. The collapse was not one event with one cause, but a wave of related collapses, each with its own local mixture of the same underlying forces, all falling within the same terrible span of decades because they shared the same deep roots and struck the same fragile, over-connected system. What we can say, what the long night of investigation does give us, is the shape of the thing. Not a murder by a single hand, but a death by many causes at once, a whole world overwhelmed by the simultaneous failure of everything it depended on. And that shape, uncertain as it is the truest portrait we can draw of the greatest collapse in the ancient world. Let the story pause here, one last time, before we ask what it all finally means. Pausing under the stars, over the ruins, in the long quiet after the world has ended. The story has done the hard work of the night now, has built the golden world and watched it burn, and weighed, one by one, all the reasons it might have fallen, and arrived at the sober and honest truth that it fell from many causes at once. And before it turns, in the last movements, to what all of this finally means, it rests one more time, in the deepest part of the night, under the stars, over the ruins of the vanished world. Picture some hillside, in the years after the collapse, above the ruins of a great city that is no more. Ugarit, perhaps, its harbour silent now, its warehouses fallen, its last unsent letter still lying in the ash where it will wait 3,000 years. It is night, and it is very quiet. The fires are long out. The raiders are long gone. The survivors, such as they are, sleep in their few poor huts among the tumbled stones. And overhead, unchanged, indifferent, endless, wheel the same stars that shone over the golden world at its height. The same stars the merchant kings steered by, the same stars the scribes and the sailors and the god kings watched, the same constellations that looked down on the crowded harbour in the golden evening and now look down on its silent ruin and find no difference worth remarking, and go on turning as they have always turned. The great world that filled those harbours and wrote those letters and armed those armies and called its kings brothers is gone, utterly, and the stars do not notice, and the sea still moves against the fallen quay, and the wind still passes through the broken walls, and the night is enormous and calm and still. There is a vast perspective in that quiet, and it is worth resting in, because it is the perspective the whole night has been building toward. Civilizations feel eternal to those inside them. The people of the golden world could no more imagine its ending than we can easily imagine ours. It was simply the world, solid and permanent, the way things were and always would be. And then it ended. Not because it was uniquely wicked or uniquely foolish, but because it was mortal, as all human things are mortal, and the forces that could unmake it happened to converge. And the stars that watched it rise, watched it fall with the same serene indifference, and went on turning, and are turning still, over the ruins of that world, and over us, and over whatever comes after us. There is no cruelty in it, and no comfort in it either. There is only the enormous calm of the night sky over the fallen city, the great turning wheel of the stars above the small human wreckage, the sea and the wind and the silence going on and on as they did before the golden world and as they will after every world. Rest there, under the ancient stars, over the quiet ruins, in the deep calm of the night after the end of an age. When the story rises for the last time, it will ask what the fall of that far-off world means for us, here, now. But that can wait for the last light of the night. For now there is only the hillside, and the fallen city below, and the sea beyond it, and overhead the same eternal stars, wheeling slow and bright and cold over the ruins of everything that was, keeping their own vast silence, as they always have and always will. Before the story turns to what survived and what it all means, it is worth pausing to reckon, honestly and fully, with the sheer scale of what was lost, because it is easy, from a distance of 3,000 years, to say the words, "The Bronze Age collapsed," and not feel the weight of them, and the weight is enormous. An entire world ended. Not a kingdom, not a dynasty, but a whole international civilization, the accumulated achievement of centuries. The great palaces, Mycenae, Pylos, Hattusa, Ugarit, and a dozen more, fell and were never rebuilt, and with them fell the whole sophisticated apparatus of Bronze Age life. The palace economies that had organized the labor and wealth of whole societies, the systems of administration and record-keeping, the specialized crafts, the monumental art and architecture. The connected world came apart. The trade routes that had carried tin and copper and gold and ivory and amber across thousands of miles fell silent, and the long-distance commerce that had bound the whole region into a single system simply stopped. The brotherhood of great kings dissolved. The diplomacy, the royal marriages, the whole international order vanished with the kingdoms that had sustained it. And most poignant of all, in many places, writing itself was lost. The linear B of Greece forgotten for 4 centuries. The scribal traditions broken, the very ability to record and remember erased, so that whole societies fell not just into poverty, but into silence, into a darkness from which they could not even describe themselves to the future. Think of what it means for a civilization to forget how to write. It means that the memory of the past, which writing preserves, is cut off. That a people loses not just its wealth and its cities, but its very continuity with what it had been, so that within a few generations the descendants of the golden world lived among ruins they could not explain, built by ancestors they had turned into gods and giants, in a landscape haunted by a greatness they no longer understood. The knowledge accumulated over centuries, the techniques, the records, the literature, the learning, much of it simply gone, as though it had never been. Populations fell, in some regions dramatically, cities emptied, the survivors scattered into smaller, poorer, simpler settlements. The sophistication drained out of the world. This is what a true dark age is. Not merely a bad time, but a collapse of the very complexity that had made the previous world what it was. A falling back, across a whole civilization, to a simpler and harder and more forgetful way of living. The specialized crafts decayed, because the palaces that had supported the master craftsmen were gone, and the trade that had brought them their materials had stopped. The fine painted pottery gave way to cruder ware. The monumental buildings ceased. No one raised great palaces or citadels for centuries. The population fell, in some regions steeply, as war and famine, and the breakdown of the food supply took their toll, and the survivors scattered into smaller settlements. The long-distance trade that had carried the wealth of the world dwindled to almost nothing, and communities that had once been plugged into a system stretching from the Baltic to Afghanistan shrank back to the horizon of their own valley, making do with what they could grow and make themselves. An entire scale of human life. The international, the monumental, the literate, the luxurious, simply switched off across a whole civilization and did not switch back on for centuries. The Bronze Age collapse was one of the most complete such falls in all of human history, a genuine ending, the death of a world. Historians who study the rise and fall of civilizations often rank it among the very greatest collapses ever recorded. Greater in its completeness than the fall of Rome, which was slow and partial and left much of its world standing, where the Bronze Age collapse was fast and near total and swallowed even the memory of what had been lost. And yet, and this is the mercy in the story, the thing that keeps it from being only a tragedy. It was not the end of everything. In the ash of the fallen world, some things survived, and a few of them were seeds. For all the completeness of the collapse, the human story did not end with the Bronze Age. People survived. And in the wreckage of the Golden World, amid all that was lost, a few things not only survived, but were set free by the collapse to grow into the foundations of the world that came after, seeds in the ash, quietly carrying the future. Consider the most beautiful example. Along the coast of the Levant, in the narrow strip of land where cities like Ugarit had traded, there were other trading cities that came through the collapse, battered but not destroyed. And in the new world that followed, with the old great powers gone and the old trade network shattered, these coastal traders rose to fill the emptiness, taking to the sea as merchants and sailors, spreading across the whole Mediterranean, founding colonies, carrying goods and ideas from end to end of the ancient world. We call them the Phoenicians, and they became the great traders and sailors of the age that followed, and they carried with them one of the most important gifts in human history. For the Phoenicians used and spread a simple alphabet, descended from the kind of early alphabetic writing that cities like Ugarit had helped to pioneer. A writing system of a few easily learned letters, utterly unlike the hundreds of complex signs that the old scribal cultures had guarded. And this alphabet, carried by Phoenician traders across the sea, was borrowed by the Greeks when they climbed out of their dark age, and adapted by them, and passed on, and it is the ultimate ancestor of the very letters on this page, the alphabet that almost all of the Western world still uses today. The connected world had to fall for the Phoenicians to rise. The great palace scribal cultures, with their guarded complex scripts, had to die for the simple democratic alphabet to spread. The collapse cleared the ground, and in that cleared ground, where no palace stood to guard the old learning and no scribal guild remained to defend its privileges, the seed of literacy. A new, simpler, more powerful literacy, available to ordinary people and not just palace scribes, took root and grew. Think of the difference. The old scribal systems, the cuneiform of Mesopotamia, the hieroglyphs of Egypt, the linear B of Greece, used hundreds of complex signs, and mastering them took years, so that reading and writing were the jealously guarded skills of a small professional class attached to the palaces and temples. When the palaces fell, those scribal cultures died with them. But the alphabet the Phoenicians carried was different in kind. A couple of dozen simple signs, each standing for a sound, learnable by an ordinary merchant in a matter of weeks, not the property of any palace or priesthood. It was, in a real sense, the democratization of writing. And it could spread precisely because it was so simple and so unattached to any single great power. The fall of the palace scribes did not end literacy. It cleared the way for a better, humbler, more powerful kind, one that ordinary people could own, and that could travel on a merchant ship from one end of the sea to the other, and that would, in time, underlie the literatures of Greece and Rome and everything that came after. There is something almost poetic in the shape of it. The palace scribes had guarded their difficult scripts as a source of power, and their power died with their palaces. The alphabet survived precisely because it was cheap, simple, and belonged to no one, because a merchant could carry it in his head and teach it to his son in an afternoon, and because it needed no institution to keep it alive. What was elaborate and centralized and magnificent perished. What was humble and portable and widely shared endured and grew, and eventually carried the whole literature of the Western world on its back. In the wreckage of the most sophisticated civilization the world had yet produced, the thing that made it through was the simplest tool in the ruins. And there were other seeds. The Iron Age that rose from the collapse, with its locally available metal, was in some ways a more broadly capable world than the Bronze one, its technology no longer dependent on a fragile web of long-distance trade. In the small kingdoms that emerged in the former Bronze Age lands, new peoples and new ideas took shape, including, in the hills of the southern Levant, the emergence of the people of ancient Israel, whose religious and literary tradition would shape the whole later history of the world. The very darkness of the Dark Age, the breaking down of the old rigid palace systems, may have opened space for new forms of society, new peoples, new ideas that the old order had no room for. This is the strange consolation buried in the story of the collapse, that endings are also clearings, that the fall of one world is the ground of the next, that the very completeness of the Bronze Age catastrophe swept away an old order and made room for new things to grow. The alphabet, iron, new peoples, new faiths, and eventually, out of the long dark, the classical world of Greece and Rome from which so much of our own descends. The golden world died, but it composted, so to speak, into the soil of everything that followed. Stand back far enough, and the Bronze Age collapse stops looking only like an ending and starts looking like a hinge. The great violent turning point between the first age of civilization and the world we ourselves descend from. Because nearly everything we think of as the ancient roots of our own world grew in the ground that the collapse cleared. Think about what came after. Out of the Greek Dark Age, slowly, across centuries, rose the Greece we know. The Greece of the city-states, of Athens and Sparta, of Homer's written-down epics, of philosophy and drama and democracy, and the whole intellectual inheritance of the West. But that Greece could only exist because the Mycenaean palace world had been swept away. The classical Greeks built something new precisely because the old rigid palace order was gone, forgotten, no longer in the way. Out of the Phoenician expansion came the spread of the alphabet and the founding of trading cities across the Mediterranean, including, in time, Carthage, Rome's great rival. Out of the small kingdoms of the Levant came traditions, including the religious tradition of ancient Israel, that would shape the spiritual history of half the world. And out of the whole reshuffled, iron-armed, alphabet-writing Eastern Mediterranean came, eventually, the classical civilization from which our own directly descends. Had the Bronze Age world not fallen, had that gorgeous, fragile, palace-centered, scribe-guarded civilization continued unbroken, the world that followed would have been unrecognizably different, and much of what we think of as our own deepest heritage might never have existed at all. There would have been no Greek Dark Age, and so, perhaps, no Homer singing the half-remembered glory of the vanished heroes, no clearing away of the old palace order, and so, perhaps, no room for the strange new experiment of the city-state and the citizen and the argument in the marketplace that became philosophy and democracy. The simple alphabet might never have spread as it did. The particular small kingdoms and peoples that emerged in the reshuffled world, with all that they would become, might never have taken the shapes they took. So much of what we are flows, by long and winding channels, from the particular way that particular world ended. The collapse was not only a death, it was, in the fullest sense, a hinge on which the whole later history of the West would turn. There is a hard and strange lesson in that, and it is worth sitting with. We naturally think of the collapse as a catastrophe, and for the people who lived through it, it was. A genuine horror, the end of their world, decades of fire and famine and death. Nothing about the eventual good that grew from it lessens the real suffering of those who died in the burning cities or starved in the failing fields or wandered the sea as desperate refugees. And yet, from the long view, the collapse was also a clearing, a making way, the violent removal of an old order that opened the ground for new growth. History is full of this terrible ambiguity, that the death of one world is the birth of another, that the ground of every new thing is the ruin of an old one, that creation and destruction are so tightly wound together we can never fully separate them. The Bronze Age collapse is one of the greatest examples in all of history of this deep and troubling truth. The worst catastrophe of the ancient world was also the seedbed of the classical world, and the fire that ended the age of bronze warmed, in its ashes, the first seeds of our own. And that thought leads, at the very last, to the hardest and most personal question the whole long night can ask. The question of what this ancient collapse might have to say to us. It is impossible to tell the story of the Bronze Age collapse in our own time without feeling it turn, at the end, into a mirror. Because we, too, live in a connected world, a globalized world, a world of long supply chains and mutual dependence and dazzling sophistication, and the story of how the last such world ended has an uncomfortable way of looking back at us. It would be dishonest not to acknowledge that. And it would be equally dishonest to press the comparison too hard or to turn a subtle and uncertain history into a simple warning. So let us walk the line carefully and honestly as we have tried to walk it all night. The resemblance is real, and it is worth taking seriously. The Bronze Age world was destroyed, in large part, precisely because it was so interconnected. Because its very sophistication and its web of mutual dependence, which made it rich, also made it brittle, so that a combination of shocks could cascade through the whole system and bring it down together. We live in a world far more connected than theirs, far more dependent on distant supply chains and complex systems and the smooth functioning of a global network, and it does not take much imagination to see that our world, too, might be vulnerable to the same kind of cascading failure. That a convergence of shocks striking a tightly coupled global system could propagate in ways that are hard to predict and hard to stop. The Bronze Age collapse stands as history's great example of how a complex, connected civilization can fail. Not through a single knockout blow, but through the compounding of multiple stresses on a system too interdependent to absorb them. That is a real pattern, and it would be foolish to pretend it holds no lesson. But honesty requires the other side too. We are not the Bronze Age, and the differences matter as much as the similarities. We understand our own systems in ways the Bronze Age kings could not. We have science and records and the ability to study past collapses, including this very one, and to learn from them. Our knowledge is not locked in the heads of a few scribes to be lost in a single fire. It is vast, distributed, redundant, preserved in ways that make the total forgetting of the Bronze Age almost impossible to imagine repeating. We have faced great shocks, wars, plagues, depressions, and absorbed them and gone on. The lesson of the Bronze Age is not a prophecy that our world must fall as theirs did. It is, rather, a caution and a piece of self-knowledge. A reminder that connectedness is strength and fragility at once. That no civilization is permanent simply because it feels permanent. That the smooth functioning we take for granted rests on systems more delicate than we usually remember, and that resilience. The ability to absorb shocks, to have reserves, to not be so tightly wounded that one failure brings down all the rest, is worth protecting. There is a further lesson, quieter and perhaps more useful, in how the collapse actually unfolded. The people of the Golden World did not fail to see a single obvious danger bearing down on them. They faced many ordinary difficulties: a hard harvest, a raid on the coast, a tremor, an outbreak of sickness, a delayed shipment. Each of which they had faced and handled many times before, and none of which, taken alone, looked like the end of anything. What destroyed them was not any one of those familiar troubles, but their arrival together, in a system that had grown too tightly coupled to absorb them all at once. That is a subtler thing to guard against than a single enemy, and it is much harder to see coming, because every individual problem looks survivable right up until the moment when it turns out that all of them together are not. The Bronze Age people could not see their own fragility until it was too late. We, having their story to study, can at least see ours. Whether we act on that sight is up to us. And that is perhaps the deepest gift of this ancient catastrophe to the living. Not a prophecy, but a mirror, in which a connected world can see, in the fate of the first connected world, both a warning and the knowledge that makes the warning useful. Let the story gather itself now, toward its close. Before the last quiet of the night, let the threads of the whole long story draw together, because the tale of the Bronze Age collapse holds within it, in the end, a few deep truths that are worth carrying away into sleep. The first is the truth of impermanence, the plain, vast fact that even the greatest and most confident civilizations are mortal. The Bronze Age world felt eternal to those who lived in it, as every world does to its inhabitants. Its kings ruled from palaces centuries old, traded along routes their ancestors had walked, worshipped gods older than memory, and had every reason to believe their world was simply the permanent order of things. And it ended, not slowly, not gently, but in a single catastrophic generation. There is no arrogance quite so certain, and no certainty quite so fragile as a civilization's belief in its own permanence. The second truth is the double-edged nature of connection, that the very things that make a world rich and sophisticated and strong, its interdependence and its complexity and its reach, are also the things that can make it fragile, so that strength and vulnerability are often the same quality seen from different sides. The third is the honesty of not knowing, that the greatest questions in history, like the greatest questions in a life, often do not have single, clean, certain answers, and that the mature and truthful response to a genuine mystery is not to force a false certainty, but to hold the uncertainty with patience, to weigh what can be weighed, and to let the whole at the center remain a whole where honesty requires it. And the fourth truth, the one that softens all the others, is the truth of continuity through catastrophe. That even the most complete collapse is not, in the end of everything. That people survive, that seeds persist in the ash, that the fall of one world is the ground of the next, that the alphabet and the iron and the new peoples and the eventual glory of the classical world all grew from the ruin of the Bronze Age, so that even history's greatest ending was also, in the long turning of things, a beginning. The golden world died. The connected sea fell silent. The great kings were forgotten, and the writing was lost, and the palaces burned, and an age of darkness came down over half the world. And yet the sun kept rising over the ruins, and the survivors kept living, and the grass grew up through the ash, and slowly, over centuries, out of the wreckage of the first great civilization, the foundations of our own were quietly laid. That is the whole story, and it is a story, in the deepest sense, about how worlds end, and about how, even so, the human thing goes on. Let it carry you gently now, towards sleep. And now the long story is told, traveller, and there is nothing left to do but let it settle, and let the day settle with it, and let yourself grow heavy and slow and ready for sleep. The golden world has risen and fallen tonight. The great kings have called one another brother and vanished. The cities have burned and gone silent. The causes have been weighed, and the honest, uncertain truth has been spoken, and the seeds in the ash have quietly become the world we know. There is nothing more you need to hold. Let it all grow soft and far away now, like a great fire seen from a distance, warm and golden on the horizon, asking nothing of you at all. Let your body grow heavy where you lie. Let the breath come slow and deep and easy, in like the tide filling a quiet harbour, out like the tide slipping back to the wine-dark sea. There is nothing to solve now, nothing to remember, nothing to carry. The Bronze Age fell 3,000 years ago, and all its fear and fire are long, long over, settled into the deep peace of things that are finished, and you may rest inside that peace, as inside a warm and ancient stillness. Think, if you think of anything at all as you drift, of the quiet after the fire. The grass growing green through the fallen stones, the goats on the hillside, the small lives going gently on among the ruins of the great ones, the slow grey weathering of everything that was, under a wide and forgiving sky. There is no catastrophe now. There is only the after quiet, the long, soft calm, the world going on in its smaller, gentler way, the ash grown cool, the ruins grown green, the night grown deep and kind. And if sleep is rising in you now, let it rise, the way the dark rises gently over the ruins at the end of the day, not as an ending, but as a returning, a softening of the whole world back into the quiet from which each day is made and to which each day comes home. The people of the golden world lay down each night as you lie down now, under the same stars that still turn overhead, and gave the day back to the dark, and trusted the morning to come. And the morning always came, over the harbour and the palace and the ripening fields, as it comes still, and will come tomorrow, whether or not any of us is there to see it. The stars are turning over you now as they turned over Ugarit and Mycenae and the great lost cities, patient and bright and unhurried, keeping their long watch over the sleeping world. Let them keep it. You need do nothing now but rest. The east will take care of the dawn. It always has. Over the golden harbour and the burning city and the green-grown ruin alike, it will come up grey, then pearl, then gold, over a world that has ended 1,000 times and begun again 1,000 times, and always, always found its way back to the light. But that is hours away yet, and it is not your concern tonight. Tonight there is only the dark and the deep and the settling quiet, and the whole long story of the world that fell and the world that rose from it, laid down now beside you like a closed book, warm and finished and at peace. Let the last of it go. Let the fire burn down to its last soft coal. Let the mist of sleep rise and take you, gently, the way the grass took the ruins, the way the quiet took the world, the way the dark takes everything, in the end, kindly and without hurry, into its deep and dreamless keeping. Sleep well, traveller. Good night.